So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. Today we're going to take a look at a rather minor figure in young Earth creationism, but still one who has some wild things to say. He also has by far the best speaking voice of any creationist I've encountered. Unfortunately, in this video he seems to have used a noise gate, but not a noise filter, so when he speaks it's going to be with some white noise in there. Also, because of the noise gate, I couldn't really run noise reduction on it in post very easily, so basically I just normalized the sound, boosted the low and high end, and this is what we've got. It's not much, but it's something. Also, the aspect ratio was weird, so I cropped the video. Anyway, this is supposed to be about the age of the Earth, so let's go.
Strike number 2, the mutation selection mechanism is effectively dead, according to Stephen Gould of Harvard.
Yes, this is indeed where the talk starts, with number 2. But let's talk about number 1 first. Macroevolution is impossible to observe. Attributed to Theodosius Dobzhansky. First, I have no idea if he said that, but it doesn't seem like something he would say. Searching for it only turned up creationist sources, but further, even if he had said it, we have indeed observed macroevolution, both in the lab and in the wild. Here are some examples. Drosophila fruit fly populations have been induced to undergo macroevolution in laboratories dozens of times, sometimes in under 20 generations. These experiments started back in 1969 and have continued on since. One of the people who did it first was in fact Theodosius Dobzhansky, the guy who, according to Kindell, said that this wasn't possible. Procambarus virginalis, the marbled crayfish, evolved in the 90s from Procambarus phallax, and it is now invasive in much of Europe. House mice were introduced in the Faroe Islands less than a millennium ago, and are already so morphologically distinct from other populations on mainland Europe that they are at least a new subspecies, and are well on their way to being a new species, if they're not there already. Currently, it is arguable whether or not hawthorn maggot flies have speciated with their sister lineage of apple maggot flies, both parasitize plants as larvae, and have separate gene pools now as a result of different breeding times, and are now genetically distinct. There are, of course, many other examples I have not listed. Further, as for point 2, I don't think Stephen Jay Gould said this, but whether or not he did, it's simply not true. Mutation and selection are still two of the most important aspects of evolution, so while Kindell might want to argue against their effectiveness is currently uncontested in evolutionary biology.
Who, at the time of his death in the early 21st century, was considered the leading spokesman for evolution.
By whom, and what does that even mean? Gould was a good science communicator, but he wasn't Pope of biology or anything. This is so weird to me.
And of course, random mutations destroys information, it doesn't make it better.
I guess he thinks that the upregulation of lactase expression later in life, resulting in lactose tolerance in adulthood, destroyed information. Kindell should probably stop eating dairy then. I also suppose the multiple gene duplications and subsequent mutations that allowed a group of notothenioid fish to get an antifreeze protein out of a trypsinogen protein, while retaining the original trypsinogen gene, somehow was a loss of information even though it resulted in a new beneficial protein without the loss of any ancestral gene. I guess the multiple mutations that allowed the simian immunovirus to leap to humans, who were previously immune thanks to their weird tetherin protein, was somehow a loss of function, even though they gained a new function without losing any old functions, and also gained an entirely new and naive host population. It is trivially easy to find examples of mutations that neither destroy or scramble information while being beneficial. Kindell is either profoundly ignorant of the topic, or is just lying. I'll let you decide which it is.
So natural selection can't select anything better if nothing better is being produced by the destructive mechanism.
Man, good thing the mechanism isn't simply destructive, and we know from both mathematical modeling and real-world observation how it works. And that it doesn't work the way this guy thinks.
So that's strike number 2. Strike number 3, not a single watertight transitional fossil is known.
Well, fossils tend to be broken up a bit, and most organisms were never watertight to begin with, so that seems likely. I'm not sure why you'd want them to be watertight, though. Is he planning to use a transitional fossil as a cup or pot or something? That's not an appropriate use of any but the most common kinds of fossils.
According to Dr. Colin Patterson, the former senior paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History.
Weird how there's no citation, right? Like, for any of these? All we get is the name of the person who said these things, except in each case, only 1 or 2 words are in quotations, so we can't even say that they said these things, only the bits in quotation are claimed. There are basically no good reasons to do this, but I can think of a lot of bad reasons to do it.
And he wrote a book on evolution And he didn't put a single example, either a drawing or a photograph of a transitional form. And when asked why, he said, well, if I knew of any that were legitimate, I certainly would have put them in my book.
So, fortunately for you, I happen to know about this one off the top of my head, because it's been a staple of creationism since the 90s and long before, despite the fact that it has been addressed since that decade. This goes back to the halcyon days of talk origins. The quote is from a personal letter from Patterson to a creationist, Luther Sunderland, and is about the former's book, Evolution, published in 1979. The book itself actually lists several transitional forms, including Hyracotherium, Archaeopteryx, and Ichthyostega. He also acknowledges that we cannot infer direct ancestry from transitional forms, which is indeed the widespread consensus in paleontology. In fact, this case was investigated by one Lionel Thunison, who actually reached out to Dr. Patterson about this. Let's read Dr. Patterson's response. Dear Mr. Thunison, sorry to have taken so long to answer your letter of July 9th. I was away for a while and then infernally busy. I seem fated continually to make a fool of myself with creationists. The specific quote you mentioned from a letter to Sunderland dated 10th of April, 1979, is accurate as far as it goes. The passage quoted continues, a watertight argument. The reason is that statements about ancestry and descendant are not applicable to the fossil record. Is Archaeopteryx the ancestor of all birds? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. There is no way of answering the question. It is easy enough to make up stories about how one form gave rise to another and to find reasons why the stages should have been favored by natural selection. But stories are not part of science, for there is no way to put them to the test. I think the continuation of the passage shows clearly that your interpretation at the end of your letter is correct and the creationists is false. That brush with Sunderland, I had never heard of him before, was my first experience with creationists. The famous keynote address at the American Museum of Natural History in 1981 was nothing of the sort. It was a talk to the systematics discussion group in the museum, an extremely informal group. I had been asked to talk to them on evolution and creationism, fired up by a paper by Ernst Mayr, published in Science just the week before. I gave a fairly rumbustious talk, arguing that the theory of evolution had done more harm than good to biological systematics classification. Unknown to me, there was a creationist in the audience with a hidden tape recorder. So much the worse for me. But my talk was addressed to professional systematists and concerned systematics, nothing else. I hope that by now I have learned to be more circumspect in dealing with creationists, cryptic or overt, but I still maintain that skepticism is the scientist's duty, however much the stance may expose us to ridicule. Yours sincerely, signed Colin Patterson. This, of course, is straight from Talk Origins, because that's how old this is, and how long ago we've known this is bullshit that this quotes Patterson.
But I don't think there are any that are watertight, that are really worth documenting in my book.
Except that he did document them in his book, a book Kindell has clearly not read. And further, as we've seen, what Patterson meant about being watertight was that he could not make a watertight case that any given transitional species was directly ancestral to a modern group. But of course, that doesn't matter. Their bare existence is predicted by evolution, and only really makes sense in terms of evolution.
Of course, if evolution were true, we should have boatloads in every museum. There should be so many transitions, but the handful that are there that they choose to argue about are simply not enough to make the case, and they're so questionable and equivocal that experts like Dr. Patterson don't even accept them, even though they're evolutionists.
I bet you know what time it is.
So 1, 2, 3 strikes and you're out, but the evolutionists claim they are exceptional.
Science isn't baseball. There's no set number of strikes. And further, none of these 3 strikes are even strikes. They're more like, lies, I guess?
And it takes 4 strikes to get them out.
Whether it's 3, 4, or a million, we haven't seen one yet.
So the 4th strike they say they must be struck out on is number 4 here. The fossil-strata relationship supposedly proves that evolution happened over ages of time.
I assume that by fossil strata relationships, he means faunal succession. The fact that the fossil assemblages of the sedimentary strata of the Earth change as you go up or down the stratigraphic column. This is why some creationists like Richard Owen or Hugh Ross accept the idea of progressive creation, where God creates different groups of organisms at various times on Earth. Why he does this isn't clear to me, but whatever, it's not my idea.
Even though we can't observe it happening, and it
Except that we do observe it routinely.
doesn't have a documented adequate mechanism,
It has several, including mutation, drift, and selection, to name the big 3.
and we don't have the transitional fossils to document it.
Don't make me pull out the yodeling again.
Supposedly, the progression from simple to more and more complex through the geological strata shows that life did evolve from simple to complex over geological time.
Yeah, basically. I'd quibble a bit with the fact that his phrasing makes it look like there's some evolutionary drive towards complexity, when this is not really true, but who cares?
The fossil strata relationship, therefore, would say that the lowest layer there, the lowest stratum, has the simplest form of life, and as you go higher up the scale, life gets more and more complex.
Well, the lowest fossil-bearing stratum, and in fact, the lowest fossils we find are stromatolites, collections of single-celled photosynthetic bacteria that form bulbous columns over time as newer generations build on the skeletons of their accumulated ancestors.
And that is, of course, how it is presented in the textbooks. In the textbooks, it looks very nifty and neat, everything in its place, everything agreeing with evolution.
It's so neat because this is explaining an abstract model, not the real world. Models are idealized. If you took physics in school, you probably had to answer questions where you were told to ignore friction, even though in the real world, friction exists. Similarly, the ideal gas laws assume that gases have no self-interaction among the atoms or molecules that make them up. This is obviously untrue, but I tell you what, when you discharge a CO2 fire extinguisher, the ideal gas law tells you that the gas that comes out will be cold, and so it will be. All models are wrong, but some are useful. Just like in physics and engineering, in order to make things easy to digest and work with, we make simplifications. The model of the stratigraphic column is idealized and presented without unconformities, reworked sections, and with only representative organisms. Models are inherently simplified, because if they weren't, then they would just be the real thing. A map is a simplified version of a place. It does not contain all the data you might need. The real place does, though. The stratigraphic column is a map to the geology of the Earth, but as a model, it will never contain everything about the geology of Earth that is true. We yet again have an instance where creationists show that they neither understand nor appreciate science.
And they even put Greek names of those various ages to make it sound scientific.
That was just the convention when these rocks were first described. And remember that fundamentally, these names are the names for rock systems, and the names for the time periods associated with them only exist because the rocks exist. The reason Greek and Latin were used is because when geology was invented in Europe, most educated men, and women were largely excluded from science at the time, had a working understanding of both Greek and Latin, because the classics were a core part of basically every curriculum in every school on the continent, as well as many schools in the colonial territories controlled by European powers. Therefore, using these languages ensured widespread understanding of the scientific terms. Since then, it has become something of a tradition to use these languages, although I am happy to report that scientists are increasingly using other languages, including native languages of the people groups who live in the areas of the new discoveries. I, as a non-linguist, would love to see more linguistic diversity in science.
Such as Paleozoic means ancient life, Mesozoic means intermediate life, and Cenozoic means recent life.
That's true.
At the very bottom, you have Archaeozoic, meaning archaic life, and Proterozoic, meaning the prototypes of the earliest, some of the earliest life forms.
Yep.
The problem with this, of course, is that nobody observed this happening.
Oh no, there's no eyewitness evidence. The worst kind of evidence. Ignore all the actual hard physical data. No one was there to write it down. Do people still actually buy this bullshit? That there was no one there to muddy the waters with their potentially dishonest and definitely faulty memory isn't exactly a problem.
This is a circumstantial evidence of fossils.
That neatly meets the predictions of evolutionary biology, when it didn't need to if evolution were wrong, making it a confirmed prediction. And of course, the radiometric dating, the stratigraphic dating, and the sedimentation experiments that real geologists doing real science have done are not circumstantial.
We don't find a complete column anywhere.
And it's a model. It was never supposed to perfectly reflect real life. If I ask you to arrange some letter-shaped fridge magnets in alphabetical order, but there's no B, no W, and no U? Does that mean you can't do it, or that the alphabet is actually fake? No. If a period of time resulted in no net deposition in a particular place, then it won't be represented by rocks in that place, and there will be an unconformity. There is no reason to expect net deposition in all places for all times. In fact, it's impossible. Deposition in one place is only possible because of erosion and sediment transport from somewhere else, which means that some places have to be net eroding during any time if there is to also be sediment deposition anywhere on Earth during that time. Fundamentally, deposition and erosion have to be balanced because one causes the other. It's like Kindell doesn't know about the rock cycle, which is weird because I'm pretty sure I learned that in middle school.
In fact, you couldn't. If this column that we see in our textbooks and our museums actually existed as a physical structure, it would not fit in the crust of the Earth.
What the fuck is he talking about? There's no rule about how thick a given stratum has to be. If you have 3 millimeters of Jurassic rock, you have Jurassic rock. Of course it could fit. It would just have to be composed of very thin layers, but so what? Even if he were right, it was never required to fit in the first place. That's not the point of the model. The model is there so you know which rocks come above and below which other rocks, so that when you're actually doing geology or paleontology, you know what the heck you're doing, and also where to look for what you want to find. Evolutionary biology and the stratigraphy of Earth are used together to tell paleontologists where to dig to find new specimens that they're looking for. If it didn't work, they couldn't make successful predictions, and their future funding for grants is at least in part dependent on their ability to get results. Results they wouldn't get if they couldn't use these models to make successful predictions. And of course, it's not just pure science that depends on these models being useful. Oil exploration does too. Oil exploration depends on basin modeling to find places where oil is likely to be found, since drilling a dry well can be financially devastating. Basin modeling depends on dating rocks correctly, which is done with a combination of radiometric and stratigraphic techniques. If these models were not reasonably accurate to the real world, then they wouldn't work, and oil companies wouldn't use them.
Because they admit it would be nearly 100 miles deep.
What I believe is dumb.
Who said that? Where did he say it? Was it no one and nowhere? I bet that's the real answer.
And the Earth's crust averages only about 20-25 miles deep on the average. It wouldn't even fit.
Cool story, bro. But is there a point to this whole thickness debate? Maybe Kindell just has a thing for skinny rocks. I don't know.
So how do they get this thing to be hypothetically nearly 100 miles deep?
Given that they didn't, I don't even know what he's talking about. But hey, let's find out.
Well, they do it by assuming certain things that they've never proven. They assume that evolution is a fact.
Evolution is a fact the same way that the Earth being a globe is a fact. It's been directly observed in real time by humans, and it also forms the basis for numerous models of the real world that make accurate predictions about future data. The only real difference is that it's harder for the average Joe to find the evidence for evolution than it is for him to find the evidence of the globe. But both are firm conclusions of science on the same basis, confirmed predictions and direct observations and measurements.
Even though it is mathematically, chemically, physically, and thermodynamically impossible.
Yeah, well, that's just like your opinion, man.
Well, we haven't been given any reason to think that, and no one has managed to convince the actual scientific community that it's impossible. Plus, the fact that we see evolution happening all the time seems to negate the idea that it's impossible. It's like saying that gravity is impossible. All the while, things continue to fall down and orbit as predicted by the law of gravity.
Who cares about the facts of science? They want to believe something, so they do, and they call it a fact.
Imagine being a guy who decides to cherry-pick the parts of Genesis that line up with his theology literally, while ignoring blatant contradictions and the flat earth implications of Genesis, then deciding that this must represent the real history of the world at the outset, and then accusing the real scientists who do not do this of having a conclusion-first methodology. There's this word that Kindell would do well to look up. It's projection. As a reminder that creationists are conclusion-first kinds of guys, let's just double-check what is required to submit a paper to the Answers Research Journal, the blog of Answers in Genesis that pretends to be peer-reviewed. Their manual for submission contains a line, "Working with your editor builds an effective partnership whose goal is to ensure that the creation and flood model is given the best possible development by all concerned." Their About page says, ARG disseminates research conducted by creationists experts in theology, history, archaeology, anthropology, biology, geology, astronomy, and other disciplines of science by providing readers with the results of cutting-edge research that demonstrates the validity of the young Earth model, the global flood, the non-evolutionary origin of created kinds, and more, showing how science is consistent with and confirms the biblical account of origins in Genesis. Gee, seems like creationism is full of conclusion first, evidence second, if at all, thinkers.
Much like our fake news calls all kinds of facts that aren't true.
I'll avoid overt political commentary other than to say, mors tyranno orantio, and may it be soon.
Nothing new under the sun.
Yay for Ecclesiastes reference. I like that book.
Because they assume evolution, and they assume that life progressed, and they assume also there were many millions of years of erosion taking place during all this time.
Those are conclusions, not just assumptions, although since they are very strong and so far never successfully contested conclusions, they are indeed simply used as assumptions in later research. You know, because that's how science works.
That certain fossils, which are extinct today, which they claim represent a certain stage of evolution, a classic example being trilobites.
Trilobites can be decent index fossils, but I wouldn't say they represent a certain stage of evolution, especially since they went extinct at the end of the Paleozoic and left no living descendants, so they aren't part of the evolutionary lineage of any living thing.
In some strata, you may find them, and they're only maybe a few feet thickness. In other areas, they might be hundreds of feet thick, the strata that contain these extinct trilobite fossils.
Man, he should have thought about that when he was saying stupid things like, the column couldn't fit in the crust of the Earth. Strata are not all of the same vertical thickness.
They assumed that the thickest layers where you find them anywhere in the world somehow escaped erosion.
Well, every layer that we find until now has escaped erosion to the extent it still exists, since if it eroded away, it wouldn't be here. It's like saying everyone alive today has somehow escaped electrocution. Yeah, if they hadn't, they'd be dead. Like, what kind of statement is this? It's basically just a tautology. But further, many layers have in fact eroded somewhat. It's just not entirely. Surprise Canyon is a paleo canyon that's exposed in the Grand Canyon. It itself is an erosional feature that shows that the layers it cut through were partially eroded. And the Grand Canyon itself then eroded through both those layers and the canyon infill layers. What are we even talking about here? Kendall seems to have the kind of knowledge of geology I might expect from a squirrel whose head was stepped on by a human.
That in most places it got eroded over millions of years, but here and there, portions of it escaped erosion, and so it was at least that thick in the past, and probably thicker.
Yup, there are places where net erosion isn't positive, and that can persist for a long time. I'm not sure what the point of this is.
Since probably at least some of it was eroded.
Something we know happens, since we can see erosional features deep in the sedimentary record of the planet. Surprise Canyon being just one famous and very obvious example.
So they take the thickest layers that they can find globally with these extinct fossils that they assume belong in different evolutionary stages, and they superimpose them on paper. So you get the thickest layers, put them one on top of another on paper. By the time they end up doing that, the column ends up being nearly 100 miles deep.
I have no idea what the hell he's talking about. Is this a dream he had one day? No one superimposes thick layers on paper. What the hell would the point of that be? Who cares how thick they are? Instead, what happens is that scientists note that certain fossils are always found above or below other fossils, and that these fossils are restricted to certain layers, which are dated both relatively with stratigraphy and absolutely with things like radiometric dating. Then these are put down as a model in order where each rock system is included, even though very few places exist where all the rock systems are present. This is then arranged vertically, since that's usually how you find strata in real life, and presented as a model so that geologists and paleontologists can orient themselves temporally in relation to the rocks they're working in. In fact, even on the chart he has, the thickness is representative of the duration of these periods as measured radiometrically, which does not correlate to their physical thickness. So even his own chart shows his idea to be basically made up. I have no idea where he got this idea. I suspect, though, that when he found it, it was covered in human fecal matter, and that if DNA tested, would match his own DNA.
And of course would not even fit in the crust of the Earth as a physical reality.
He said only seconds after noting that the thickness of the strata of the Earth vary, thereby making the statement incoherent, even if it wasn't already completely inconsequential, even if true.
So this is purely a mental abstraction, a hypothetical reconstruction.
Young Earth creationists both fail to understand the very basics of science and also hate science, Exhibit 3,093,210b.
And then the main problem with it is that they start with the assumption of evolution.
Nope, that was developed primarily by creationists who lived and worked mostly before Darwin. Granted, they weren't Kendall's flavor of creationist, being mostly day-agers, gap theorists, or progressive creationists, but they were not part of any biological evolution community. And early on, the geologists tended to oppose evolution because they thought the Earth was in fact too young for evolution. Turns out, though, that since they were not basing their conclusions on the Bible, even when they were creationists, their models were robust enough to persist despite the academic triumph of evolutionary theory in academia. Probably because their models actually reflect important aspects of reality with reasonable utility and accuracy.
The fossil record is very mixed up. We often have fossils that are supposed to be old, on top of ones that are supposed to be young.
Sure would be cool if we had an example of this. An actual out-of-place fossil. Of course, he also went with the dumbest version of this by pointing to supposedly old fossils in young strata. The problem is that nothing about evolutionary biology demands that a particular group go extinct. The assessment of the extinction of ancient organisms is based on their disappearance from the fossil record. Finding a fossil after the supposed extinction of the group just means that we were wrong about when that group went extinct, and at least one lineage managed to make it to the time that the new fossil was found. This has literally nothing to say about evolution. What would be far more profound would be a fossil much too early. I'm not talking about a bird in the late Triassic when before we thought they originated in the Jurassic. I'm talking about a bird before our first evidence of tetrapods, like an early Devonian. Now that would be a problem, because that's basically a derived dinosaur before land vertebrates even seem to have existed. What we really need is what should be young organisms embedded in old rocks, and for this to be accomplished without reworking, since if the strata are disturbed such that young rocks have fallen into some crevice or other opening, that can make it superficially appear like a young fossil in old rock. Of course, we can test for reworking. If the allegedly reworked sediment is non-uniform in the direction of deposition, or it is significantly chemically different from the surrounding rock, etc., that is good reason to think that the sediment was reworked, and therefore naive stratigraphy can't be used to date the fossil. And if Kendall wants to say that that isn't a real thing, he'll have to explain the fact that reworking happens right now. We can see it happen. What would make such things impossible in the past? I can't think of anything.
And we find this many, many times. They say that overthrusting put them in the wrong order, but almost all the time there's no physical evidence to corroborate the theory of overthrusting.
Yes, there is. Here, look at these pictures of rocks with very obvious signs of overthrusting. If he wants to posit instances where rocks have been said to be overthrust without any evidence, he's accusing geologists of fraud, which means he should produce evidence. What specific allegedly overthrust rock does he think are actually in situ? My guess is that he has no such specific rocks. Won't bother to dive into any specifics, and will simply continue on after having accused basically an entire field of science of fraud. Let's see if he proves me wrong.
It just doesn't conform to what evolution says.
I mean, even if he's right, that's not clear since he went with the exact opposite scenario that would be problematic for evolutionary biology. Creationists have a knack for getting everything as wrong as possible. They really are just like flat earthers with a bigger budget, aren't they?
So they use the priority of the paradigm. In other words, evolution must be true, and any evidence that contradicts it will have to be reinterpreted to force it to fit. If it's too difficult to force it to fit, it will simply be called anomalous.
You know what? Let me remind you of something I said earlier. Imagine being a guy who decides to cherry-pick the parts of Genesis that line up with his theology literally, while ignoring blatant contradictions and the flat earth implications of Genesis, then deciding that this must represent the real history of the world at the outset, and then accusing the real scientists who do not do this of having a conclusion-first methodology. There's this word that Kendall would do well to look up. It's projection. As a reminder that creationists are conclusion-first kinds of guys, let's just double-check what is required to submit a paper to the Answers Research Journal, the blog of Answers in Genesis that pretends to be peer-reviewed. Their manual for submission contains the line, "Working with your editor builds an effective partnership whose goal is to ensure that the creation and flood model is given the best possible development by all concerned." Their About page says, ARG disseminates research conducted by creationists experts in theology, history, archaeology, anthropology, biology, geology, astronomy, and other disciplines of science by providing readers with the results of cutting-edge research that demonstrates the validity of the young Earth model, the global flood, the non-evolutionary origin of created kinds, and more, showing how science is consistent with and confirms the biblical account of origins in Genesis. Gee, seems like creationism is full of conclusion first, evidence second, if at all, thinkers. Yeah, it's really not the scientists who are doing conclusion first work here.
And it will be censored because we don't want the public to be confused by things that might make them think evolution is not true. After all, we all know it's a fact.
And of course, we have no examples of such censorship forthcoming, whereas creationists just openly say that they won't publish things that don't support their conclusions. This is the pot calling the kettle black when the kettle is in fact chrome.
So this column was erected based on the assumption evolution is true in the first place, and millions of years is true in the first place, and yet it's used as the main proof for evolution and millions of years.
It was in fact constructed without absolute dating, and even before evolution was widely accepted. And it was done primarily by people who believed in divine special creation. Heck, even Lyell, the guy who basically invented uniformitarianism, was famously skeptical of Darwin's ideas. even though they were friends and he encouraged Darwin to publish.
Now, you don't have to know much about logic to realize that's a textbook fallacy known as circular reasoning.
I know my interpretation of the Bible is literally true because the people who publish creationist papers refuse to publish contradictory information, because they believe it's true too. And if it weren't true, there'd be stuff published in the creationist literature about that. So the Bible is true because the people who say it's true say so. Yeah, it's definitely the scientists with their statistics, hypothesis testing, data gathering, and peer review who are the ones doing the circular reasoning. And no, you don't actually need any examples of any of the things that the scientists are allegedly doing wrong. Some guy with a baritone voice says they're doing it wrong. You wouldn't disbelieve someone who kinda sounds like Darth Vader, would you? Of course not.
Where you use the theory to prove the theory. Use the assumption that the theory is true to interpret the evidence so that it always confirms the theory.
No one is doing that, because no one is trying to prove evolution. Just like no one is trying to prove that gravity exists, or atomic theory in chemistry, or the globe shape of the Earth. That evolution is true is a debate from over a century ago, and it's a debate that evolution has won and which has yet to be reopened, because no one who wants to reopen it has anything to bring to the table. So yes, evolution is now assumed to be true by biologists, geologists, and paleontologists. Just like the existence of atoms is assumed by chemists, gravity is assumed to exist by structural engineers, and the fact that the Earth is a globe is assumed by meteorologists.
Because any evidence that contradicts the theory is held to be illegitimate, because after all, we already know the theory is true.
Or, now hear me out, the people who base all their ideas about science on a book that says that having animals drink and mate in front of stripy sticks makes their offspring stripy, maybe aren't actually bringing any good evidence to the table, and so far, there really hasn't been any compelling evidence against evolution. That's at least a bare possibility, I think.
But if you use the theory to build the column, and then use the column to prove the theory,
which isn't even close to what happened, but hypotheticals are fun.
It's really using the theory to prove the theory.
Yeah, that sure would be. Good thing that the column was invented by creationists then, so we don't have to worry about that problem.
Yeah, that is classical circular reasoning. You might as well just say evolution is true because we assume it's true, and we're going to use that assumption to build this column.
Welcome to Dinosaur News at Noon on the Dinosaur News Network. My name is Vishanti, and our top story tonight comes from the internet. Scientists had long thought that the minimum level of self-awareness was 0, but recently creationists have shown that it can, in fact, be negative.
And then, of course, the column will be a self-fulfilling prophecy because it has to conform to what evolution predicts, even though there are many fatal contradictions.
Wouldn't it be fun, now that we're well into the video, if he bothered to give us any, actual ones that hold up to scrutiny and aren't just lies? Of course he won't, because, spoiler, there aren't any.
Now then, one of the most powerful contradictions that really fatally destroys the theory is the finding of advanced mammals.
I think he said mammals, but I'm not sure.
For example, with the dinosaurs, mammals that were not supposed to have existed with the dinosaurs and were not supposed to have evolved until millions of years after all the dinosaurs went extinct.
Mammals evolved in the Jurassic, unless we're seeing actual rats or chimpanzees in the Cretaceous or something. The bare existence of mammals with non-avian dinosaurs is to be expected. So I guess it's just going to be a series of straw men of evolution at this point. That's fun.
If they're found together, then basically it supports the Bible.
No, it doesn't. It just fails to contradict the Bible. This isn't a dichotomy.
But these animals were created at the same time, the same week of creation in the beginning. They lived together in the same world. They got buried by the same flood.
Then we should actually expect to see things like elephants in the Permian. We should find whales in the Cambrian. We should find birds in the Carboniferous. We don't.
And therefore, of course, although there are different ecological zones.
Yep, fossil assemblages aren't divided up just ecologically, but also following a vertical pattern that does not map onto ecology. The deserts of the Permian had animals like Scutosaurus and Gorgonops, but it lacked animals like elephants and camels, even though ecologically they should have fit right in with that environment. Similarly, the seas of the Cretaceous had mosasaurs, but not whales. So while across the horizontal section, yes, fossils are grouped by ecological zone, that falls apart when you realize that the zones are inconsistent vertically, and that vertically, within any given ecological zone, the fauna still exhibit turnover in ways that only evolution can explain. And creationism can't really even accommodate. There's a reason that creationists don't touch biogeography, let alone paleobiogeography.
And therefore, with the flood, you would predict a general order from simple to complex based on ecological zonation. There would also be many mix-ups.
Why would that be the prediction? Ocean life isn't characteristically simple. Many highly complex organisms live in the ocean. In fact, I'm not sure how he could say that a swordfish is more or less complex than, say, a moose. Or for that matter, how a trilobite is less complex than, say, a dragonfly. But even if he thinks mammals are the height of animal complexity, there are mammals in the ocean too, or did he forget about dugongs and whales? And that's just the full-time ocean-dwelling mammals. If we include all the ones who spend considerable time in the water, we have to add in the sea otters and the pinnipeds, and to some degree even polar bears. If the flood started with burying marine ecosystems, we should find modern complex vertebrates in the lower shallow marine strata in places like the Cambrian. But we don't. Further, the typical fossils should actually change their ecology as we go up the stratigraphic column, but there are marine lacustrine and fluvial environments from top to bottom. How did the marine sediments containing trilobites all end up below the marine sediments with mosasaurs, which are all below the sediments with whales? And how did those three sets of marine deposits end up sandwiched with terrestrial fauna between them? Were the mosasaurs actually hill mosasaurs and the whales actually alpine cetaceans? See, this only makes sense if you just don't think about it and don't actually know what's in the fossiler strata of the Earth.
It would also be, because of the complex currents involved in these floods, a mixing of the ecological zones, and you would find modern-type mammals with dinosaurs predictably.
Cool, but we don't find that. I agree that we should if the global flood myth were historical rather than literary, but we don't find that. We find primitive mammals in the Mesozoic, generally small, mostly insectivorous, nocturnal things that if you saw them would probably remind you of a shrew, but are no more a shrew than you are, unless you watching this are also a shrew. Shrews are welcome here. I just suspect most shrews aren't avid YouTube watchers, but I don't know you. You do you. There are no Cretaceous beavers, badgers, bats, bison, babirussas, baboons, bears, bandicoots, or binturongs. But if they all existed alongside the non-avian dinosaurs of the Cretaceous, there should be.
They declared it's very rare, and if it is, it's an anomaly, and it's not worth talking about, but it turns out to be very common.
Wow, that's interesting. It sure would be nice if we got an example. You know, a fossil that we can look up. Something like a pangolin in the Permian, or a giraffe in the Jurassic, or a cat in the Cretaceous.
It's just that the fake news has been hiding it.
Yes, of course.
Fake news.
Yeah, that's it. Of course, the news has nothing to do with it, since such examples would be reported primarily in the paleontology literature, not the nightly news. So, where are the papers? Also, he is just suggesting that the reason he has no evidence is a conspiracy. But that doesn't help him. We still need to see the evidence of the first claim, these alleged out-of-place fossils, but now we also need to see evidence of the conspiracy. Making up a conspiracy always makes you less believable, never more believable. It's a really bad move, unless of course you actually do have the evidence, in which case it's not made up and you should present it.
But Dr. Carl Berner is an MD, not a PhD, and usually medical doctors can make a whole lot more money than the average PhD physicist or scientist or whatever. And with his money, he and his wife traveled around the world. He wanted to write a book and do a video series on fossils that look the same today as they do in the fossil record.
Ah yes, the Harun Yahya bit of pointing to a fossil, pointing to an animal, often ones that are actually nothing alike, and then pretending that they're actually identical. It's barely a step above presuppositional apologetics in terms of how good of an argument it is, and presuppositional apologetics is the lowest form of argument I can even imagine.
Although their counterparts in the fossil record are supposedly many millions of years old.
And asking where the evolution is does nothing to change those age estimates.
And yet they look the same today. Apparently evolution just didn't work for them somehow.
So, a couple things. First, that's assuming that the fossil organism even is what is claimed, which often it's not. And that the modern organism is what is claimed, which often it's not. But second, some lineages are under stabilizing selection. You see, there are three basic kinds of natural selection: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. Directional selection is what most people think of when they think of natural selection. Some aspect of the environment induces a particular change in a population. This is the kind of selection that the famous peppered moths underwent in England during the Industrial Revolution. The trees got darker, and so darker colored moths were less likely to be eaten because they were harder to spot. This caused the population to be more often melanistic or black. Disruptive selection is similar, but more than one change is favored, pushing parts of the population in different directions over time. An example is sneaky males in some cuttlefish. In species with sneaky males, there are two types of males: the large ones who fight for territorial dominance and have harems, and the small ones who are about the same size as the females and who pose as females in the harem in order to mate with some of the actual females in the harem. Both large size and small size is favored, but intermediate size means losing dominance fights and not getting a harem, but also being unable to mate by sneaking into a harem. So medium-sized males are selected against. A hypothetical example might be a species of rat being preyed upon by owls. If they are smaller, then they are harder to notice and have an easier time escaping into small burrows or other hiding places. But conversely, perhaps some rats are big enough that they are not seen as prey by the owls, or can effectively injure the owls, causing them to be released. In this case, some rats will evolve to be smaller, or some larger, which may eventually cause the two groups to speciate. Finally, stabilizing selection occurs when an organism is highly adapted to its environment such that any members with significantly variant traits are lower fitness, and so natural selection serves to eliminate novelty in the population. Some lineages have stable niches and are highly adapted to them, like many decapods, xiphosaurines, and chondrichthyes. We should expect to see examples of all types of natural selection in the fossil record, and cherry-picking the examples of stabilizing selection does nothing to undermine the theory of evolution.
Yeah, so in doing his research, he traveled, over 100,000 miles around the world, flying to different dinosaur dig sites, and just saying, I'm a medical doctor, but I'm interested in paleontology. I'm wanting to write a book on it. And I'd like to just help you dig and excavate these dinosaur fossils here and see what's going on. And so I'll have, background research to write my book and everything.
So he lied. Now, granted, it was a lie by omission, but still a lie. A person lies, in my opinion, when he or she undertakes any action designed to convince another person of something the first person believes not to be true. So Werner, according to Kindell, went around convincing paleontologists that he was working on a book about paleontology, when in fact he was working on a book attacking paleontology, which is not at all the same thing. Good to know that the tradition of lying to support young Earth creationism is going strong.
And they were glad to have him help and everything, but what he found was amazing. What was really going on, what they were really finding. So he said, we looked only at the fossils found at the dinosaur dig sites so that scientists who support evolution could not suggest that the fossils we looked at were not quote-unquote old.
Seems like a reasonable step. If you want to show that something was living with non-avian dinosaurs, going to a fossil site with non-avian dinosaurs would be step one. Well done, Carl.
We found fossilized examples of every major animal phylum living today.
Well, first, no, they didn't, because there are no known rotifers until the Cenozoic, as far as I can tell, even though I am sure they were around during the Mesozoic. But further, basically every phylum evolved sometime in the Cambrian, or maybe the Ordovician, since bryozoans are unknown before the Ordovician. Since that's long before the Triassic, when the first dinosaurs show up, it would be weird if every animal phylum wasn't around, since they had already evolved. But also, I highly doubt he found any ornithophorans, or poriferans, or platyhelminthes. Maybe that's why he went with major phyla, because then he gets to just say whichever ones he actually found were the major ones.
Including birds and mammals.
Well, first, yeah, they evolved in the mid-Jurassic, so I would expect them to be found in mid- and late Jurassic, as well as Cretaceous layers well known for non-avian dinosaurs. But also, those are the same phylum, Chordata. Does Thomas Kindell, or maybe just Carl Werner, not know what a phylum is?
And not primitive birds and mammals, but some of the most highly evolved type that were not supposed to exist with the dinosaurs, according to their own theory.
That's not true, but I do at least now know where other creationists get their weird talking point that there are Mesozoic avocets, penguins, and parrots. It seems like it's probably from this book. In fact, on checking, yes, the exact list of birds that both AIG and Genesis Apologetics have used are found in Werner's books, with lorikeets, flamingos, cormorants, sandpipers, and loons being reported from the Lance Formation, and avocets, albatross, ducks, owls, and seagulls from the Hell Creek. First, both the Lance and Hell Creek are from the very end of the Cretaceous, long after many birds had evolved, including within modern groups such as Chiratoformes, Galliformes, Anseriformes, and various paleognats, etc. Several Chiratoforms, or possible Chiratoforms, are known from the Lance Formation, and other Chiratoforms include modern plovers, sandpipers, gulls, terns, and auks. But none of the Lance Formation Chiratoforms have been shown to be in any of the 19 modern families. Similarly, there is at least one species of fowl, but it might actually be basal to the split between water and ground fowl. And there are some proto-pelicans, but they're just that. They're basal to true pelicans. So if you want some bird evolution, it's right there in the Lance Formation. The Hell Creek is similar. There are no modern birds in either place, but there are animals in groups that still exist. But the problem is that all modern groups of organisms have ancestors that lived in the Cretaceous. So if you pick any modern animal, you can find examples of members of at least some taxon to which it belongs at any point in the past, including the Cretaceous. It's just that as you go back in time, you may have to move up the taxonomy so that by the time you're in, say, the Miocene, you might be finding members of the same family. In the Cretaceous, it might be the same order. In the Triassic, it might be the same class, and in the Ordovician, it might be the same phylum. That is what evolution would predict, and just pretending that basal members of modern groups are the same as modern animals doesn't change that. It just makes one a liar, and Carl Werner is a liar.
He said, contrary to popular belief, modern types of birds have been found, including parrots, owls, penguins, ducks, loons, albatross, cormorants, sandpipers, avocets, etc.
Except that that's not true. Members of larger clades to which these birds belong have been found, and that's what we should expect. What Werner is doing is fundamentally no different than saying that we have humans in the Triassic and using Probainognathus as your example, because humans and Probainognathus are both cynodonts. Or saying that we have Cambrian elephants because Pikaia and elephants are both chordates. It's either a profound stupidity that is hard to believe could exist in an MD, or it's a lie. And since Werner was apparently asking actual paleontologists about this, and they were certainly not telling him these modern animals were found in the Cretaceous, I suspect it's the latter.
When scientists who support evolution disclosed this information during our TV interviews,
which isn't a thing that happens, but okay,
it appears they could hardly believe what they were saying on camera. And in fact, their admissions on camera that they did, in fact, with him find these advanced birds with the dinosaurs is sufficient to destroy the theory.
So I went to Kendall's source for this, and the only citation in support for this is that one Tom Stidham found a jawbone that he interpreted as a parrot, which is in line with genetic studies done a decade later that recovered a Cretaceous divergence time for Psittaciformes and Falconiformes. But could Stidham assign the jaw to any modern extant parrot taxon? No, of course not. So we go from the published peer-reviewed literature that says that there were some ancient parrots in the Cretaceous, which is in line with later genetic studies, to Werner's interpretation that there were modern lorikeets in the Cretaceous, a completely unsupported claim.
They simply can't be that wrong and still have any credibility.
Well, I think I found a clip to use in the future.
He went on to say, at the dinosaur dig site, scientists have found fossilized mammals.
Well, obviously,
that look like squirrels, possums, Tasmanian devils, hedgehogs, shrews, beavers, primates, and duck-billed platypus.
Oh, looks like the mating call of the conspiracy loon. Yeah, lots of things look like things. This cliff looks like a guy. This island looks like a dolphin. This rock looks like an elephant. This toast looks like Jesus. This chimpanzee looks like a guy who lies to children. This cave looks like a vagina. The canyon looks like a lightning bolt. This non-mammal looks like a beaver, etc. That doesn't mean that those things are the things they look like. If you want to find things in the fossil record that kinda look like modern things, that's easy, because animals with similar lifestyles tend to resemble each other superficially, despite being only very distantly related. There's a reason that dolphins look like sharks, and it's not because they're sharks. Similarly, if you find a proto-mammal that lives in rivers, it shouldn't be a surprise that it shares traits with modern actual mammals that live in similar places in similar ways. But that doesn't mean you found the actual modern animal.
No, I highlighted the word primates because that means of the prime order. The primary, the most highly evolved creatures ever produced in the history of evolution are the primate.
Evolution isn't a ladder. Primates aren't more evolved than other orders of mammals. The name was selected by Carolus Linnaeus, who was a creationist and thought that since humans were primates, that the primates were the highest form of mammals. And since he believed in a version of the great ladder of being, in which humans are only a bit below the angels who are just below God, that means that primates must be the greatest or first in importance in all of the orders of mammals. But evolutionary biology does not hold to some great ladder of being. Indeed, that idea has been rejected in evolutionary biology for about a century now. The name is just a holdover from Linnaeus, and its etymology does not factor into modern ideas about the evolution of primates.
So that includes things like lemurs, monkeys, apes, and even man is considered a primate.
that's true.
So these things were not supposed to be anywhere near the dinosaurs. They are supposed to be evolved many millions of years after the dinosaurs went all extinct.
Well, the oldest known primate is Purgatorius, and it was found in Paleocene rocks from about 2 or 3 million years after the end of the Cretaceous, which means that primates probably diverged from colugos right around the end Cretaceous, and the split between colugos and primates as a group, the Euarchontans, and the Gliers, or lagomorphs plus rodents, probably happened sometime just before the end of the Cretaceous. Of course, it would be nice to know specifically which fossil Werner, and through him Kendall, thinks was a Mesozoic primate. I would contend that there is no such fossil.
And to find things like primates is absolutely fatal to the theory of evolution.
I mean, primates are a group of mammals, and mammals evolved in the Jurassic. So from the outset, without any fossil or genetic data for primates directly, I would expect that they would show up anytime after that. They did in fact show up after that, and not, it seems, until after the non-avian dinosaurs were gone. This is very frustrating. If I told you that an organism existed in, say, the Jurassic, say the oldest known therian mammal, that is the group to which kangaroos and humans belong, but that excludes the platypus, I would tell you that it's Jeremiah. And if you wanted to know who found the fossil and where, etc., I would point you to the paper A Jurassic Eutherian Mammal and Divergence of Marsupials and Placentals by Luo et al., published in Nature on August 24th, 2011. If you say a fossil organism existed and you can't name it and give at least some peer-reviewed description of it, then there's no reason anyone should even think it exists. The fact that Kindle can't do this should be a red flag.
But of course, it does not get reported. It gets canceled. It gets censored.
Oh, back to the conspiracy theory. Remember, claiming that the truth is being hidden, so that's why you don't have any evidence, isn't actually evidence. And you still need the evidence. But now you also need evidence of the conspiracy.
He said few are aware of the great number of mammal species found with dinosaurs. Paleontologists have found 432 mammal species in the dinosaur layers.
Yeah, that seems plausible, but I'm not going to look it up, as I don't really care.
432? I believe there's only a little over 500 dinosaur species that have been found.
I think it's closer to like 700, if you don't count modern birds, but again, I don't really care. There is no magical ratio of Mesozoic mammal species to dinosaur species that will suddenly make the fact that mammals evolved in the Jurassic a problem for evolutionary biology.
So they found almost as many mammal species in those same layers as they have dinosaurs. Not many people hear about that. That can be looked up statistically, but it's not something they put on the evening news.
Yeah, because here's about the most impressive Mesozoic mammal, Rapanomamus. And it was indeed covered in the news. But let's compare it to Titanosaurus. Which of these do you think is going to get more media coverage? Probably the one the size of a building, and not the one the size of a dog. And remember, all other Mesozoic mammals are even smaller, and generally only known from very fragmentary remains, often just teeth. The media want clicks and subscriptions, so they're not going to spend time on things people are unlikely to care about, and that includes the next shrew-sized jaw fragment of a multituberculate mammal found in the Cretaceous. It's not a conspiracy, it's just basic economics. Companies do the things that get the money.
Because people might ask the question, how in the world can that be if they evolved at different times?
And then they'll be told the very obvious answer, that the evolution of a group does not require the extinction of another group. Nothing about mammals evolving requires that dinosaurs go extinct, although it did take the extinction of most dinosaur groups for mammals to be able to evolve to fill megafaunal niches.
Then he said these include nearly 100 complete mammal skeletons.
There are almost no complete skeletons in the fossil record of any kind, let alone of small animals, so I find this hard to believe. But if it's true, then it should be really easy to tell which animal is a Mesozoic primate, or whatever the particular claim is that the skeleton is supposed to support, so that the claim can be assessed. But it's weird that we keep hearing just vague terms, and only one citation that I had to go digging for, and which didn't really say anything that would help Kindle or Werner's case.
But where are these fossils?
Museum collections, probably.
We visited 60 museums, but did not see a single complete mammal skeleton from the dinosaur layers displayed at any of these museums.
Yeah, museums typically only display the stuff people will come see, because the display aspect of the museum is the public-facing, money-making arm. If you want to see specimens that aren't of much public interest, like the skeleton of a rat-sized Jurassic mammal, you're going to have to look at the specimen storage area of the museum. But that's a thing you can do. I've been in museum storage and fossil prep areas. I just asked nicely. It's not really that hard to do. You can ask, and chances are that if the staff can accommodate you, someone can escort you to see the fossils that aren't on display. You might have to set up a day in advance to do it, and you might want to contact the museum director, but it's a thing you can do.
Now, a complete vertebrate skeleton from the fossil record is incredibly rare. Therefore, every example should be on display in some museum everywhere.
Non sequitur. Your facts are uncoordinated.
Yet here they have nearly 100, but they weren't put on display.
Look, the last time I went to a museum with fossils in it was when I was in the LA area, and Vishanti and I went to some museums there. Now, Vishanti is a friend of the channel, a personal friend, and a smart person, but she's not exactly a paleontology enthusiast the way, say, I am. You know what she wanted to do? Go see the dinosaurs. Sure, she looked at some other stuff like big marine reptiles and a mounted baleen whale skeleton, but she wasn't there to look at tiny mammal skeletons. Indeed, one of her biggest takeaways was just how big ceratopsians could get and how some of them had skulls taller than she is. Humans like big, impressive things. That's why giants might be the most common cross-cultural legendary creatures. But there's a world of difference between not putting something on valuable museum floor real estate and hiding it. These mammal fossils are not hidden, they're openly published on, and if you really want to see them, you can. It just takes effort.
Why? Because people would ask very embarrassing questions like, what are these advanced mammals doing with dinosaurs when they weren't supposed to exist at that time and were not supposed to have evolved for millions of years later?
No, that's not why. It's because they probably wouldn't ask questions about them at all and would just ignore them, and even potentially not bother going to the museum if they can't see what they came for. But even if they did ask those questions, the easy answers are that they're not particularly advanced and no one ever said that these mammals only evolved much later. That's just something creationists seem to have made up.
Doesn't that fatally weaken the theory of evolution? Well, yes, of course it does.
I'm sorry, but the fact that people are wrong about when mammals evolved and that other people lie about what mammals are found in the stratigraphic column isn't a fatal wound for the theory of evolution. It's just people being ignorant, sometimes willfully so. That's something that has been going on for as long as there have been humans, which is a couple orders of magnitude longer than Kindle thinks the universe has existed, because he happens to be one of those ignorant people, and almost certainly one of the willfully ignorant types.
And that's why it is canceled, that's why it is censored.
Publishing about these finds in literature is literally the opposite of the finds being censored.
As it says in Romans chapter 1,
I couldn't possibly care less for the purposes of this discussion what it says in any part of the Bible. It's a scientific empirical evidence or get out kind of deal here. After this, Kindle launches into an extended thing about how evolution contradicts his interpretation of the Bible. It clearly does, and that's a problem for his interpretation of the Bible, and I don't care about that fact.
Okay, now I'm going to quote some evolutionists here to corroborate what I've said already.
Well, this bodes ill. I don't care what some guy said. I care about the evidence. Scientists say all sorts of things, but the data is what determines what conclusions are to be reached in science. When Pons and Fleischmann said that they had invented cold fusion, the data didn't back them up, even though they said all sorts of cool things about cold fusion. And you could easily make a case that cold fusion is both really cool and very effective just by quoting them. But they were wrong. Science isn't about personalities, or at least it's not supposed to be, even if sometimes it fails to live up to that ideal. But fundamentally, personalities fall out of favor, and what remains is the data. Thomas should tell us about the data.
Dr. Derek Ager, former head of the British Geological Association, in his book New Catastrophism, he said nowhere in the world is the record, or even part of it, anywhere near complete.
Yeah, this isn't news. Darwin lamented the incompleteness of the fossil record. Near as I can tell, no one has ever argued that the fossil record comes even close to preserving all species that have ever existed, or that we are anywhere close to finding all the organisms that are currently preserved in it. Yet despite this, we have a plethora of transitional forms, and the occurrence of groups of organisms couples well with things like estimates of divergence times from genetic studies, thereby corroborating the predictions of evolution by making them via separate lines of data that would only be related in this way if evolution were true.
So when I said this geological column does not exist in its complete form like this anywhere in the world, and indeed if it did, it wouldn't fit the crust of the earth, he's saying the same thing. It has to be put together on paper.
Yeah, that's how scientific models work. They're not the real thing. They're constructs that are simplified that help you figure out the real thing. Yet again, we have a creationist complaining that science is doing science things, when he would rather that science just not be done at all.
It does not exist in its complete form anywhere in real field geology.
Yep.
And when you go to the real physical equator, it's not a really big red line across the whole Earth. But that doesn't make Earth fake.
Also, I quote here Carl Dunbar in his book Historical Geology, the second edition, and he admits that no single area contains a record of all geological time.
Yeah, for the contrary to be true, that area would have to have never weathered in its entire history. That seems impossible. So of course no location has a deposition for a continuous 4.5 or so billion years. That's all that means.
We need only discover and correlate enough of the what? The scattered fragments. That's the way it is. It's very mixed up.
No, that's the point. It's actually not mixed up despite being fragmented. Despite the fragmentation, the layers always come in a consistent order once the original order of deposition is established, which is established independently of applying the model of the geologic column. Cambrian layers are never deposited on top of Jurassic layers, and you never dig down through Silurian rock, only to end up finding that it was deposited directly on top of Miocene rock.
But using evolution as the key to the puzzle, they can put it on paper to look exactly the way they want to.
Nope, the stratigraphic column was developed before the theory of evolution, and it was developed by creationists. The very fact that Darwin was able to talk about different rock systems by name is because this model had already been worked out by the time he set off on the Beagle.
All the contradictory evidence is neatly censored.
That's a mighty big claim, especially since so far the only argument in favor of it that we've been given is that museums don't display tiny mammals as often as big dinosaurs. I feel like that is insufficient evidence to confirm the existence of a vast conspiracy among museum curators and directors, geologists, paleontologists, nuclear physics, astronomers, biologists, and more. And yes, a conspiracy to hide the evidence for young Earth creationism or against the conclusions of science that it opposes would have to extend to all of those people and more.
It's labeled anomalous or invalid because obviously it contradicts evolution. It can't be true because that's just not conceivable.
Wow, that sounds like a dastardly thing to do. I wonder if we're about to get any actual examples that we can look into.
And so they built it up from a scattered jigsaw puzzle using evolution as the key to the puzzle.
Okay, I really want to emphasize the degree to which Tom is getting this backwards. Stratigraphy got its start with Steno's laws. Nicholas Steno was a Danish naturalist working in the 1600s. He came up with principles still used today, such as the law of superposition, the law of original horizontality, the law of cross-cutting relationships, and the law of lateral continuity. Granted, he didn't work out the full model we have now, but that was the start of the modeling of the Earth by stratigraphy. By contrast, the publication date for the first edition of Origin of Species was 1859, some 200 years after stratigraphy was established as a field of study. Unless Kindell wants us to believe that some guy from Denmark was actually gifted with prescience and was the original Kwisatz Haderach or something, stratigraphy was worked out long before the theory of evolution was, even though both have undergone updates since then.
And of course, it always agrees with evolution because of that.
And there's the reason for the lie. Stratigraphy strongly supports the ancient age of the Earth and the predictions of the theory of evolution. The fact that they were developed independently means that their cross-confirmation increases the confidence we can have in both. So Kindell has to make up a way in which they are circularly dependent, and he does this by pretending that stratigraphy was based on evolution, which is impossible.
Dunbar again, he says, for more than 100 years, the geologists of all countries have been cooperating in this endeavor, and the total thickness of the stratified rocks now recognized would exceed 500,000 feet or some 95 miles if the beds were directly superposed. That's where I said it's nearly 100 miles deep because of how they hypothetically put the thickest layers of fossils on top of each other to form this chart called the Geological Column.
Ah, so this is where he got the stupid and wrong talking point that no place could have an example of all the strata because it would be too thick. Of course, the actual currently existing stratified rock would reach absurd depths if stacked together in a single column, but that doesn't mean that any possible column with every layer would be that thick. In reality, the actual rocks of the Earth aren't all as thin as they possibly could be, but in hypothetical land, they all can be. It seems that Kindell really is stupid, not just dishonest.
Now then, in the textbook Geology by the evolutionist geologists Putnam and Bassett, they outright admit this thing is based on circular reasoning, a textbook fallacy of logic, and is therefore invalid to prove anything.
Well, first, science isn't in the business of proving things, but second, no, that is not them admitting that stratigraphy is circular, because it's not. Relative dating does not solely depend on fossils, but once relative dating is established, it can be used to work out the locations of fossils in different sites independently. And then once it is noticed that the flora and fauna of different fossiliferous strata are correlated across the globe, then the flora and fauna can be used to help date subsequent areas. Then, of course, we get to the ellipsis. And in a quote from a book that seems to be from the 1970s based on my research, and that I have no easy way to get a copy of. But given the long history of dishonest quote mining from creationists, you'll have to forgive me if I don't take at face value that these bits from the book actually go together.
He says that the early form of an organism was clearly older than rocks containing later forms. Now stop right there. The Bible says that all animals, big and small...
No one gives a f***. Geology is about what's in the rocks, not what's in a book.
So how do we look at a dead thing in rock and know that it's an early organism as opposed to one that's an older organism?
Stratigraphy and radiometric dating. Evolutionary biology is actually superfluous to this. That's why progressive creation was a thing. It accepts the relative and even absolute dating, but denies the evolution part. Because it turns out that you don't need evolution to determine the age of rocks, whether in relative or absolute terms. And we know because historically that used to be a very common stance in science.
We didn't see them. We didn't observe them getting fossilized. It's an interpretation based on a preconceived idea.
Technically, that's not wrong. We have to assume that the universe operates according to the same sets of rules and principles now that it will in the future and did in the past. That's the fundamental assumption of science, the temporal invariability of the way the universe operates. Mr. Kindell is welcome to reject the idea of empiricism if he'd like, but that is the same as rejecting the validity of the very idea of science, which is all about empiricism. Really, I suspect that that is what Kindell actually wants to do, but he knows that science is so popular, he can't really call for people to ignore it altogether.
The idea being that if it's a simpler organism, it must have evolved sooner and is therefore older. If it's a more advanced organism, it evolved later and is therefore more recent.
Nope, simpler and advanced are not opposed to each other in evolutionary biology. And that's part of the reason that biologists have started to drop the word advanced in favor of the word derived. In evolutionary biology, there are two pairs of words that mean the same thing. The older pair is primitive and advanced, and the other pair is basal and derived. Primitive and basal mean the same thing, as do advanced and derived, but neither set of words means simple or complex. An example of a highly derived or advanced animal that is radically simple is myxozoans. These are cnidarians that typically only have a handful of cells and in some species don't even have mitochondria. The basal form of myxozoan would have been much more complex, resembling a modern coral or jellyfish. Basal or primitive means the ancestral condition, and advanced or derived means the later evolved condition. You can't simply look at an organism in isolation and determine if it is basal or derived. You need to look at it in the context of its ancestors' potential descendants and contemporaneous relatives. Now, once you've done that, if you have a rock on which no other stratigraphy has been done, nor has it been dated absolutely, you can use the basal or derived characteristics of an organism to give a guess as to how old the rock is, but that's never going to be enough to confirm it, and you should always try to use more reliable techniques. For one thing, basal forms of organisms can persist long after their relatives have become highly derived.
So they're using the assumption that evolution took place, even though they can't prove evolution is even true, to interpret how they look at fossils and where they put them in the geological column.
Evolution is the universally accepted consensus among biologists. No one has ever successfully challenged it, and there is no counter-evidence. The only reasonable thing to do is to accept it as true and go from there. Evolution is on a similarly firm foundation of evidence as the globe shape of the Earth, the idea that physical matter is made up of atoms and molecules, or the fact that gravity is real and makes matter move towards other matter. Kindell is welcome to not believe these things, but a biologist assuming that evolution is true is no more ridiculous than an engineer assuming that the theory of universal gravitation is true when he's designing a bridge, or a chemist assuming that atomic theory is true when coming up with a new chemical reaction, or a doctor assuming the germ theory of disease is true when prescribing antibiotics to treat an infection. Evolution is the firm and so far unshaken conclusion of centuries of scientific study and advancement. We don't need to repeat all that work in order to simply take it as true in future work. That is how science builds upon itself, by accepting previous work so long as new data do not challenge the conclusions of that previous work, and then building from there. We don't ask that someone designing a new car actually go re-verify all of Newton's work. We don't need NASA to rederive Einstein's equation every time they need to design an interplanetary antenna, etc. Scientists routinely assume that the work of earlier scientists is sound until they find something that indicates it is not. I once again have to point out that for a group of people who claim to love science, young Earth creationists really actually hate science to its core. They hate the very process of science. They want science to stop. Young Earth creationism is one of the most retrograde forces that is imaginable in the field of science. They're right up there with the Taliban banning weather forecasts because only Allah knows the future, and predicting the weather in a week's time is blasphemy.
Fossils are nothing but dead things in rock.
Not quite. That describes body fossils, but not ichnofossils. Those are fossils too. Things like coprolites, fossil burrows, fossil trackways, etc. are just as much fossils as the skeleton of a dinosaur is.
And if you pick up this dead thing in rock and hold it up to your ear, it can't talk to you and say, I'm of the Cambrian age and I'm 500 million years old.
Which probably explains why you never read about a paleontologist listening to a fossil for audible clues when it comes to dating fossils. But then you also can't pick up a fossil and ask it how much it weighs. You have to use a tool to measure that, which, we can and do, and we use other tools to measure its age.
They have to be interpreted, and they're interpreted based on their preconceived idea that evolution is true in the first place.
This is getting a bit exhausting. Of course they need to be interpreted, but that interpretation isn't related to their age, but rather their placement in the tree of life, which is a separate question. But the fact that the age corresponds to predictions from evolution isn't an example of circular reasoning, but rather that evolution continues to make accurate predictions about what life was like in the past in instances where we haven't actually found fossils yet. What's actually going on is that evolution is making predictions, and since evolution has been pretty damn good at that, people tend to accept the predictions at first, but then later, when they use actual independent dating techniques and the techniques give ages that line up with evolution, even though they in no way depend on evolution, that strengthens the case for evolution, and that keeps happening every single day.
So that's why they always end up in the order. No matter what mixed up order you find them in, it doesn't matter. They go in the order evolution says they ought to be, because they use the assumption that evolution is true and has taken place to put them in the right order on the chart.
And so far, all we've been given to think that that's true is that Carl Werner doesn't know how to identify birds. Not exactly a compelling case.
And fatal contradictions are simply ignored.
I'm not going to ignore a fatal contradiction. I'd love to be proven wrong, to be convinced that there's definitely a god I can worship for an eternal blissful existence. The problem is, though, that when I go looking for such things, they always end up being creationists, either being profoundly stupid or profoundly dishonest, or both. And Kindell isn't exactly offering up a counterexample.
They call them stratigraphic leaks or reworked specimens or eroded and radioposited specimens, all kinds of hypotheses to explain why they should not be there.
You know, reworked deposits are a real thing. I would love to know of an example of one where Kindell thinks that the evidence of reworking is insufficient, and we have a truly anomalous fossil. I feel like at this rate, though, he's established the pattern that he'll just say things and then offer no actual examples so people can look into it for themselves. His argument just comes down to trust me, bro. But the problem is that I've looked into too many creationist arguments, and trusting a creationist to tell the truth is like trusting a scorpion riding on your back across a pond to not sting you. Scorpions sting. It's their nature. Creationists lie. It's their nature. And the ones that don't tend not to stay creationists for very long.
Even though the physical evidence often is not there at all for that, but they have to have some convenient way to say it doesn't really have significance.
So the claim is that scientists are just claiming reworking, even though in most cases there is no evidence of that. The thing is that every time I've seen a scientist claim that some rocks have been reworked, they've provided evidence. So where are these unevidenced claims of reworking? Like, do we actually have any? This seems like it's Kindell's MO. Just find an explanation for what he thinks is otherwise anomalous data, given the current scientific paradigm, and then contend that there isn't actually any positive evidence for that explanation, even though there actually is. And he isn't inclined to actually give us any examples of the explanation being invoked without such evidence. He just assures us that it is. But I don't trust Thomas Kindell, so why should I take his word for it?
And usually they do it just by not talking about it. They don't put it, they don't mention it in the fine print, and most people don't even know there are contradictions.
Then how does Kindell know about it? Like, let's say that someone found a modern human in, say, bed 2 of the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, which would be hard to explain, as that is before modern humans seem to have evolved. This seems like a clear example of the kind of thing he's going on about. So what would the scientific community do? Fail to report on the find? Well, no, and I know because I'm referring to OH1, an anatomically modern human found in bed 2 of the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. So let's dive into that find and see if the handling of it corresponds to what Kindell is telling us. It was unearthed in 1913, as I have said, in bed 2. The Olduvai Gorge is split up into bedding layers, each of which has different types of rock, as well as somewhat different fossils. The numbers start with 1 as the lowest and go up from there, so it was found in the second lowest layer. So was it hidden? Nope, it was published in books, and it is still published on in the literature. In fact, the main source I'm relying on for it was published in 2017, 106 years after it was initially dug up. Now, it is understood as a specimen in reworked rock, meaning that it actually probably is from the time of bed 4 or later. Was this decision arrived at arbitrarily in order to save evolution? Nope, it turns out that the sediment around OH1 was consistent with a mix of beds 2, 3, and 4, but not with in situ preservation in bed 2, like the Homo habilis remains found nearby. Since it's impossible to be buried in sediment that hasn't been laid down yet, the only explanation is reworking. Also, to corroborate this, the skeleton has been carbon dated to around 16,000 years old, give or take about 1,000 years. This is consistent with bed 4 and not bed 2, so yeah, that's what actually happens in the literature. And Kindell doesn't actually have a counterexample. He just has the claim of a vast conspiracy.
And that's like it is with the fake news.
Fake news.
If you don't hear what's going on, you don't know about it.
I really wish Tommy here would take Cheeto Hitler's cock out of his mouth and give us an actual example, rather than just tossing around accusations at the scientific community at large.
And that works very conveniently.
Yes, in fact, tossing out unsubstantiated conspiracy theories is a very convenient shield for when you don't have a single bit of evidence, but you want to believe anyway.
Okay, so the early form of an organism was clearly older than rocks containing later forms. Furthermore, all rocks that had the early form, no matter how far apart those rocks were geographically, would have to be the same age. Would you correlate them from different continents based on the stage of evolution, something that's never been proven?
First, science doesn't prove things. Second, evolution is no longer in the business of being demonstrated. That happened about 100 years ago. If Tommy here wants to overturn it, whining that it's not proven isn't going to help. The globe shape of the Earth isn't proven in the sense of mathematical proof either, but it's still not being investigated as if it's one possibility among many. It's the only possibility. Evolution is in the same boat. The time when it was being questioned is long gone. Every single line of evidence is in line with evolution, and most of them exclusively so. The fossil record, radiometric dating, taxonomy, taphonomy, astronomy, genetics, morphology, all line up to tell the same story, that of an ancient Earth on which life has been evolving for billions of years.
Notice he admits, in this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Notice the admission, without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist.
I mean, he's flatly wrong, but whatever. Argument from Quote Mine isn't going away anytime soon.
In other words, you can't build this geological column. It can't exist even on paper unless you assume the theory of evolution is true in the first place.
Weird then how it was actually built before that, although it is true that later refinements are indeed aided by evolutionary biology. But it remains a simple fact of history that the stratigraphic column in its basic form was indeed created primarily by Christian creationists who believed in special creation.
The problem is they use this geological column as the primary proof. After those three strikes, this is their last bastion of defense, the fossil-strata relationship, and so they use it as the primary proof that evolution is true, and yet the column can't exist unless you assume the theory is true.
No, the primary proof is the genetics, because that's the thing that evolution is about, change in the genome over time. Paleontology provides support and corroboration, but we could erase all data and theory about geology and paleontology, and evolution would remain one of the best supported ideas in all of science, and the unifying theory of biology.
So if you have to assume the theory to prove that it's true, then that's classic circular reasoning, and is therefore logically invalid.
Kind of like how you know that the story of Noah's Ark is true, because it's in the Bible, and you know the Bible is true because it says so.
They simply can't be that wrong and still have any credibility.
Yep, that sums up young Earth creationism and most other forms of pseudoscience.
Now, here we have Ronald West, paleontologist at Kansas State University. He probably got excommunicated from the evolutionary fraternity for even admitting this in writing.
Ronald West's most recent work I can find is Dependent and Independent Data in Paleontology, Tools for the Sedimentary Modeler, published April 2024 in the Kansas Geological Survey. I see him with 53 published works, including from 2024, 2018, multiple papers from 2017, and so on. The work Kindell is citing is from 1968. Seems like he hasn't been excommunicated.
But he admits that contrary to what most scientists write, the fossil record does not support the Darwinian theory of evolution. Because it is this theory. There are several. There are different theories of evolution, but it's the Darwinian theory that is used to interpret the fossil record.
First, Ronald West, along with all these other people Kindell is quote mining, is not a prophet. Science does not work that way. Scientists are often wrong, and West was wrong when he wrote this. The easiest way to tell is that evolutionary theory predicts future fossil finds. The most famous example is Tiktaalik. Neil Shubin at FAM were trying to find a fossil of the transition from more basal stegocephalian fish like Eusthenopteron, and later stem tetrapods like Ichthyostega. They looked through the geology literature and the evolutionary biology literature to determine the time and environment when such a creature likely lived, then looked for where the right type of rock from the right point in time was exposed, and found that it was in Ellesmere Island in northern Canada. There they found exactly what they were looking for and named it Tiktaalik. But the thing is, this is not really exceptional. Paleontology digs are generally funded based on expected finds, and the way that people can successfully predict where they will find the kind of new fossil they're looking for is a combination of stratigraphy and evolutionary theory. Every single fossil that was predicted beforehand, which is most of the at least vertebrate new species found in the fossil record now, is itself evidence that the fossil record in fact supports evolution. And even without the stratigraphy, the fact is that transitional forms are found all the time that are predicted by evolution, further supporting the theory.
And a competing theory, at least theoretically, as a hypothesis, is creation in the flood.
Which new find was predicted on the basis of young Earth flood geology? Seems like it's none. Is it none?
It has a right to compete to explain the evidence.
Absolutely, flood geology has the right to compete. The problem is that it did. It already lost. Just like the miasma theory of disease, the phlogiston theory of fire, and the undulating theory of light have the right to compete, and did in fact compete. And all of them lost. Disease isn't caused by noxious odors. Fire isn't made of a special substance called phlogiston, which is contained by flammable substances, only to be released when they burn. And light doesn't propagate by moving a physical medium that suffuses the universe. Similarly, there never was a global deluge. These ideas weren't rejected because people wanted to live in sin. They were rejected because they were tested and found to be false.
They don't use that to interpret the fossil record. They use the assumption Darwinism is true.
Well, not Darwinism, but modern evolutionary theory, and yes, they do. Because when they do, they get results, whether it be new fossils of the kind predicted, or new sources of oil. When flood geology is used, no results are obtained, which can be seen by the fact that flood geologists are out there making bank for oil companies, or discovering new dinosaurs on the regular, unlike conventional geologists and paleontologists. And the thing is, no one is stopping creationists from doing paleontology or geology. In fact, Loma Linda sends out field paleontology teams fairly regularly, and they're a young Earth creationist school.
So he says, which we use to interpret the fossil record. By doing so, we are guilty of circular reasoning, if we then say the fossil record supports this theory.
Wow.
A scientist was wrong in the 60s? Whoop-de-do.
So using the assumption that evolution is true to put the fossils in the order that they want them in, even though we don't find them in that order.
He keeps saying that without giving a single actual example. It's almost like he's making it up.
Is classic circular reasoning and is admitted by some evolutionist authorities.
Well, good thing we now have radiometric dating and predictions based on evolutionary biology that actually mean this isn't circular at all, and is strictly empirical and statistical evidence in favor of common ancestry and changing morphology of organisms through time.
So, Encyclopedia Britannica is a rapidly evolutionary encyclopedia, but every now and then a jewel of truth kind of slips past the editors, and I think this is one of those nuggets of truth.
Ah, yes, pathologizing the acceptance of the evidence for well-supported principles in science. Well, you too, Tom.
Here they say the end product of correlation, using index fossils, stage of evolution fossils, to build up this column, is what? A fact of science? No, a mental abstraction.
Yes, that's what a model is, you dunderheaded devious dolt. It's an abstraction you can hold in your mind or in some kind of math that shows you how to predict future data and explains past data. The whole point of models is that they don't have to exist physically, but they still predict physical phenomena well enough to be useful, despite simplifications. Yet again, we have a creationist showing how much they actually loathe science.
Called the Geological Column. We don't have to be afraid of a piece of paper that doesn't exist in field geology, that can't even be put together.
Yet he manifestly is, and he should be, because the data on the ground say that basically his entire view of world history isn't just wrong, it's physically impossible.
Unless by their own admission they indulge in the logical fallacy of circular reasoning. It's just a mental abstraction based on their assumption that they assume what they want to believe, and that's the only assumption they're going to go with.
Yup, and it just so happens to be the assumption that gets results when results matter.
And no evidence to the contrary is allowed to see the light of day.
Kind of like how Superman isn't allowed to see the light of day, not because anyone is trying to suppress him or anything, but because, he doesn't exist. Of course, if Tom disagrees and thinks that counter-evidence does exist, he could have actually just cited an example of it. And no, positing a vast conspiracy doesn't actually help with that.
Fatally destroying this whole concept of different ages of geology and life evolving over many millions of years into different stages of more and more complex forms is the evidence we now have of soft, flexible tissue, largely intact cell structures, and largely intact proteins.
Oh goody, here we go.
In dinosaurs, which are supposed to be at a minimum 65 million to 240 million years old.
Only if we exclude birds, but sure, whatever.
And even some creatures from the so-called Cambrian age, in excess of 500 million years old, which is more than half a billion years old.
So I just went hunting for examples of preserved soft tissue from the Cambrian, and all I can find is permineralized soft tissue, which is not what he's talking about. He's talking about preserved biomolecules that retain some of the mechanical properties of the original tissue, but I can't find anything about that from the Cambrian. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but if it does, it doesn't seem to be widely reported. Of course, if Tom bothered to ever give examples, I could look into this in more depth, but it's beginning to feel like perhaps he just doesn't actually have examples.
The problem is these soft tissues and structures could not survive because there are 5 major processes, 5, not 3, that break them down over time.
Okay, weird way to put it, but let's see what these 5 processes are that prevent biomolecules from being preserved in a way that keeps some of the mechanical characteristics of the original biomolecules.
When confronted with this, the evolutionists say, well, there's 3 main things that break them down over time. Number 1 is bacterial or microbial intrusion, which would eat up the soft structures and metabolize them and destroy them relatively rapidly.
I mean, they would, but the very fact that something has fossilized at all usually means that they were in an environment where bacteria are significantly impeded in digesting the organism. Usually, bacteria are more used as a potential alternative to preservation, in that they can contaminate the fossil with biomolecules, which can be mistaken for preserved original biomolecules.
But if they're sealed off from microbial intrusion, and they're sealed off from excessive oxygen and water, oxygen would break it down by oxidation and water by hydrolysis, then conceivably these structures could last for millions of years.
Especially if there is something that can strengthen the molecules to make them even more resistant to decay, such as, the presence of iron atoms, which can cause some molecules to loop around themselves, called cross-linking, which then exposes much less of the molecules to other chemicals that could break them apart and is generally a lower energy state, making the molecule less likely to spontaneously decay. Oh, and what do you know? These finds tend to be associated with iron, particularly from blood. Also, cross-linking is the same basic mechanism that makes formaldehyde work as a preservative for organic molecules. It's why museums can preserve specimens of animals essentially indefinitely, even in areas where normally decay would be fairly rapid.
Not true, because there are 2 other things that would break them down within a minimum of just a few 100,000 years.
Ooh, the 2 weird tricks paleontologists don't want you to know about.
What are those other 2 factors?
I don't know. Apparently, they're secret.
One is the second law of thermodynamics.
Jesus Christ, that's not exactly something paleontologists don't know about. But since cross-linking is in fact the thermodynamically favored condition if there's something to cross-link around, and you can tell it is since it's a spontaneous reaction and thermodynamically favored reactions and spontaneous reactions are the same thing, then they'll cross-link around it and stay that way. But hey, who cares, right? Let's just pretend that you can say, second law of thermodynamics, and it just means things turn into smaller things inevitably over any time period that's convenient, even though that's not at all what it means. The second law of thermodynamics is that entropy in an isolated system must go up over time or stay the same. It cannot go down. So what is entropy? Well, it's a bit hard to describe, But there are a couple definitions that work well from different perspectives and get you to the same place in the end: a macro-scale definition and a micro-scale definition. Let's start with a macro-scale definition. In this case, entropy is a measurement of the amount of energy in the system that is unavailable to do work in the mechanical sense. Work is just the displacement of matter. If you pick up a stone and move it, then the amount of work you did is measured in the energy it took to move that stone to the new location, and it is measured in joules, the same unit as energy. Work needs energy, obviously, and to get energy to do work, there needs to be an energy gradient. Think about a steam engine, which is the classic case in thermodynamics, and indeed the reason thermodynamics was invented in the first place. If the steam is not hotter than the air around it, you can't use it to spin anything, and so you can't really extract work from it. This also means that if a whole system lacks energy gradients, it can't do work. This ties into the microscale definition of entropy. At the scale of particle physics, entropy is a measure of how many microstates the subatomic particles in a system can take that will result in the measured macrostate. That probably sounds like a bunch of nonsense, but really it's not that hard to understand. Imagine a glass of water with a cover on it to prevent evaporation from reducing the total water in the system. You leave it on the shelf somewhere where it won't be disturbed for several days. When you go look at it, it should be calm, still, and largely unchanging. It should also have a temperature equal to the room it's in. Now, think about all the water molecules in that cup. They're bouncing around in there, and we know because they're not at absolute zero temperature. So at the scale of water molecules, that calm water is in constant motion, with trillions of particles bouncing into each other, sometimes forming weak hydrogen bonds, sometimes going up above the surface only to be replaced by another molecule in the air above the water level, etc. Each position each water molecule takes, and their momentum, all recorded, is the microstate of the water. And clearly, there are trillions upon trillions of microstates that can account for the clear, calm water. Now imagine that you measure the microstate down to the protons, neutrons, and electrons in the water. That's the kind of microstate we are concerned with entropy. It turns out that the closer a system is to thermodynamic equilibrium, that is, not having any energy gradients, the more microstates are available for the system to take that will result in that macrostate. And so the number of available microstates that will result in the measured macrostate turns out to be the same thing as the amount of energy unavailable to do work. Now, it turns out that because particle physics is a stochastic thing, it is technically possible for entropy to spontaneously decrease, but it is fantastically unlikely in any system big enough for humans to care about. So we still call the second law a law. Now, you're probably wondering what the heck that has to do with the decay of biomolecules, and other than the fact that if a lower energy state exists that a molecule could spontaneously take on, it will, and that often, but not always, that corresponds to decay, well, nothing. And since cross-linking is indeed thermodynamically favored, it turns out that the second law actually also promotes preservation in some situations. Situations where there is a chemical makeup that allows for the cross-linking. So the second law of thermodynamics can either hinder or cause decay. It is not just a one-size-fits-all, everything gets worse and smaller kind of thing, even though that's how creationists often frame it.
The law that states that with time, all structures break down from complex to simple, from order to disorder.
Nope, it doesn't at all. Like, there's nothing about simplicity, complexity, or order or disorder in the concept of entropy. The amount of energy unavailable to do work in a system just does not map well onto the concepts of order or complexity.
It affects biological compounds and structures, absolutely. And it's more efficient at warmer temperatures than cold temperatures.
Efficiency doesn't make any sense in this case. Efficiency in physics is basically a measurement of the amount of energy that is lost when doing work. Think about sliding a brick. If you were to slide it across a very sticky surface, a lot of the energy you had to use to move the brick would be lost to friction. On the other hand, if you slid it down a heavily greased, slick surface, very little of the energy would be lost to friction. This means that the second scenario is more efficient in terms of the energy needed to perform the work of moving the brick. Now, at high energies, it is the case that molecules are faster to take on thermodynamically favorable configurations, which often means breaking apart. So in hot systems, entropy can increase faster than in cold systems, but that is not efficiency. In fact, speed and efficiency aren't really related in physics.
But almost all dinosaur fossils are found at the temperate zone on the Earth.
That's more because digging at the poles or the equator kinda sucks than because that's where the dinosaurs lived. There are in fact lots of dinosaurs in Alaska and Antarctica, but I'll be damned if I'm going to freeze my tail off digging for them.
And at those temperate temperatures that they would have been subjected to, the Arrhenius equations, where they run experiments and heat these things up to a higher temperature than normal and see how much they break down thermodynamically. Then they use the equations to plot and predict at lower temperatures how fast they would be breaking down.
Hey, that's true, but you know that the sort of originator of this whole field of study, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, a former young Earth creationist and currently devout evangelical Christian, did that very thing, but also tested iron cross-linking and found that iron cross-linking allowed these molecules to persist in cross-linked form basically indefinitely. So Tom kind of just debunked himself by mentioning such experiments.
Every time they've done that, they come with the conclusion that even the strongest proteins, such as collagen, which is like 3 different proteins wound together like a rope.
Well, it's triple helix, but each single helix is a collagen strand, so it's not like it's 3 different kinds of protein. But yes, it is very robust.
Very, very strong protein. Even that would break down completely in just a few 100,000 years.
Yeah, but what if it's in a preservative, like iron-laden blood or formaldehyde? Oops, then it lasts more or less indefinitely. Granted, it won't be in completely its original configuration, but it will still be recognizably collagen. I feel like Tom here doesn't really keep up with a lot of other young Earth creationists, because they normally don't want to accept the validity of these kinds of experiments at all. Because while yes, they do show that normally these molecules are completely gone in hundreds of thousands of years, they also show that proposed preservation mechanisms for which we have evidence will allow them to last indefinitely. And they don't want that to be true. Not at all.
And that's a big, big problem when you have it largely intact and other less robust proteins largely intact within dinosaurs and other creatures, even from the Cambrian, like beardworms.
Beardworms? Well, at least that's something I can look up rather than just Cambrian. So let's see where this gets us. And the answer is nothing. I can't even find much about beardworms from the Cambrian at all. The on-screen graphic isn't from beardworms, and I know I'm not going to get much in the way of a citation from Kendall. I was really hoping for something, but not even creationist sources showed up that I could find. If you know what he's talking about, put it in the comments, because if that's true at all, I really want to know about it. But you can't put a hyperlink, so just write the name of the paper and the publication and at least the lead author.
Where we have substructure in proteins. Now then, so we see in this case the structure from this T-Rex. This is from Mary Schweitzer, who did some of the groundbreaking work on this.
I'd argue it was basically all her and her assistant, but also I bet Kendall ignores the fact that she's a former young Earth creationist who is really sick of creationists misrepresenting her work, and who remains a devout evangelical as far as I know, and when last I read anything from her discussing her religious affiliation.
And we can see the nucleated red blood cells still largely intact.
I can see what looks like nucleated blood cells, but are they that? We don't know. Dr. Schweitzer can't confirm that they were. I personally think it's more likely than not that they are, but that's my hunch after looking at the findings. That's not the actual findings.
Her main hypothesis was that iron released from the hemoglobin in the blood cells caused cross reactions.
Cross-linking.
Cross links.
Hey, he got there! And of course, she experimentally demonstrated that this was both possible and preservative using the exact kind of experimental setup that Tom here has already mentioned.
In the proteins that made them tougher, and supposedly they were tough enough to last for millions of years. She only ran her experiment for a couple of years.
So what? She did it using the exact method that Tom accepts for simulating long periods of time, using high heat. Sorry, but that's his standard. Him not accepting this as a valid method is just him being dishonest.
And others who tried to emulate the experiment didn't get the same results. That's a big red flag in science. When you do the same experiment, you don't get the same results.
And of course he won't cite those studies, but when I looked into this, iron cross-linking was still well regarded as a mechanism in 2023, and I did not find much that was disputing it since Dr. Schweitzer's 2013 paper on it. Further, while other mechanisms that are supplementary have been suggested, all involving protein cross-linking, interestingly, there seems to be no serious doubt that iron cross-linking is an explanation for at least some preservation of Mesozoic soft tissue. Also, I want to note that he's citing MSNBC, and not, the actual paper by Schweitzer et al. I find that incredibly inappropriate and amateurish. If you're wondering, the 2013 paper about iron cross-linking is A Role for Iron and Oxygen Chemistry in Preserving Soft Tissues, Cells, and Molecules from Deep Time by Schweitzer, Zhang, Cleland, Goodwin, Boatman, Thiel, Marcus, and Thakra, published in Proceedings B of the Royal Society on January 22, 2013. See, I cited a paper, something it seems Kendall is biologically incapable of doing.
Furthermore, we have now destroyed the whole hypothesis.
Interesting. Will this be the first ever actual contribution to real science from a distinctly creationist framework? Let's find out.
Because we have found soft tissues in creatures that did not have iron from hemoglobin or from the environment. There's not iron in the tissue.
Well, as I said, there are other cross-linking mechanisms that have been recognized in the last dozen years or so. But that's not really all that surprising. But I'd love to know exactly what he's talking about.
So iron cannot be the answer.
Well, it can't be the answer, but it's still an answer. It still works, and it still explains a large portion of the molecular level soft tissue preservation that we observe. This is like discovering that one can take a plane from Boston to Chicago, and then declaring that therefore there is no way that you could take a train, except that you can. Amtrak runs trains that connect those cities.
And she's even admitted that in those cases, it simply can't be applied.
Wow, the already well-known fact that one mechanism doesn't explain all molecular fossils.
Whoa, this is worthless.
But they've all refused to even mention something they don't want you to know about.
Kindell is the most conspiracy brain motherfucker I've ever covered. This dude is at like Flurf levels of conspiracy brain. It's all secret cabals trying to keep the real science away from you, because I guess the conspirators want to go to hell or something. They certainly don't seem to want the fame and fortune that would come with overturning every field of science simultaneously at a fundamental level. That would be inconvenient or bad or something. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me.
There's a fifth factor that would break this down within at least a few 100,000 years that cannot be avoided. Does anybody know what it is?
I hate when speakers ask questions like that. If you're giving a lecture, you're the one who is supposed to know things and tell people the things you know. So just tell them. Unless it's a smallish classroom setting, these kinds of questions are never answered and they are just annoying time wasters. Really? Alpha particles? Unless they're in the bones, that's not going to be much of a problem. You can shield from even high levels of alpha flux with like a sheet of paper. They won't even get through your skin. The mean free path, or how long an average alpha particle will travel before bumping into something in granite and other similarly dense rock, is measured in micrometers. And you know how I know? Because that's what makes the polonium halos in granite that creationists are so enamored with. There just is no way that alpha particles that are not internal to the fossil are going to be a very big deal inside the fossil. Now, some fossils are indeed quite radioactive, but as far as I can tell, that's not the case for the fossils with this soft tissue preservation. Which makes sense, since if they were radioactive, we probably wouldn't find molecular fossils. And how is this being kept a secret? It's not like the existence of one of the most common kinds of radiation from nuclear decay is a secret. Alpha particles are just basically bare helium nuclei with a quartet of nucleons, with 2 protons and 2 neutrons. That mass and charge tells you why they are so easy to stop. Being charged, they are deflected or attracted by charges at a subatomic level, and being relatively massive themselves, they tend to hit nuclei fairly regularly.
Well, it's bombardment by alpha particles by decay of radioactive elements in sedimentary rocks, such as uranium and thorium. These sedimentary rocks are primarily eroded from igneous rocks, lava rocks.
That's true.
Which often contain particles of uranium and thorium, which give off alpha decay, alpha particles, which are higher energy.
But have much, much, much smaller mean free paths than, say, beta particles or gamma particles.
Can actually penetrate partway through rocks.
Yeah, like 40 microns in. That's technically part way, I suppose.
And because of the bones tend to absorb these into them, they get this bombardment directly from close proximity within the bones. And all of the data indicates it would completely destroy any soft tissue, cell structure, proteins completely within a few 100,000 years.
All of what data? I can't find anything about this, which is becoming a theme. Is Kindell just making this stuff up? It seems like he has this as his own pet hypothesis, but isn't bothering to test it. You know, most alpha emitters that could have entered a fossil within the past 6,000 years of a young Earth timeline would still be there. He could just test to see if fossils actually have significant alpha flux in their interior. It's not like there aren't actual Mesozoic fossils in creationist collections, and it's also not like a probe that can detect alpha particles is some new thing. Drill into a fossil bone, like the ones that normally contain soft tissue, or even better, one that's known to, and check the alpha flux. I bet it will be very low in most cases. And in cases where it's not, like many radioactive fossils, that fossil won't contain molecular fossils derived from proteins. Plus, you could do a different experiment where you actually have a known alpha source and hold it up to the fossil and then put the probe in and see if then the alpha flux goes up. If he did any of this, he could just show us the data instead of doing what seems an awful lot like pretending that there are data that seem not to exist.
This is such an inexorable problem, something for which they have not even a theoretical answer.
Or even as far as can be seen, an awareness that this is a problem at all. In fact, it seems that even other creationists besides Kindell don't know about this. This alleged problem isn't showing up even on creationist websites. It really seems like this is just Tom's little pet gotcha bullshit he made up, and no one but he takes it seriously. That's kind of cute in a pathetic sort of way.
But they often don't like to mention it at all, hoping people don't know about it. If you do mention it, they do admit grudgingly, well, yes, it's a problem. But when we ask them what's the obvious solution, they don't have any.
I don't think this is a conversation that happened. First, I very much doubt that Kindell is in correspondence with any actual scientists. I mean, what would they talk about? He'd just say all manner of stuff so stupid it sounds like it came from a potato infected with blight that smoked too much meth, and then the scientist's brain would leak out of their ears in protest, since most of them aren't as inured to this kind of brain rot content as I am. Second, it's not like there wasn't pushback against Schweitzer's finds inside the scientific community. They came up with basically every reason possible to say that it wasn't actually intrinsic to the bone, and yet even within that context, I can't find anything about alpha particles.
So again, censorship.
Call me crazy, but I don't think we need to posit intentional censorship to explain that an idea seemingly made up by some guy no one has heard of, who says stuff on par with that paragon of intellect Eric Dubé, or perhaps Mark Sargent, is not really talked about widely. It's kind of like how there aren't really a lot of architects or civil engineers actually addressing the ravings of Mudflutters, or Roger from Mud Fossil U. But hey, maybe there really is a secret society silencing Kindell in particular. That seems absolutely insane, but hey, Tom seems a bit loopy, so maybe that checks out. Also, really, call me crazy in the comments, it helps feed the algorithm. Just don't mention the algorithm in your comments. It can read them, and it knows when you say something like, commenting to feed the algorithm, and it won't count those comments.
It's kept a lot of people from realizing that the iron hypothesis has been disproven by finding of the soft tissue without any iron.
That's not even how basic logic works. That's like saying that you've disproved roast beef sandwiches by discovering that corned beef sandwiches exist. That's just not how anything works. All that means is that iron isn't a one-size-fits-all hypothesis, which is acknowledged in the literature now. Just like sometimes you want to change it up and swap from a roast beef sandwich with horseradish mayo, lettuce, and cheese, and instead reach for a Reuben. The weird thing is that I'm not even hungry right now as I write this.
And nobody has even a theoretical explanation as to how these could survive alpha particle bombardment by ground radiation for anything more than a few 100,000 years.
Yeah, but also no one has an explanation for how they could have survived bombardment by neutron radiation. Probably because there is no reason to, since there's no reason to suspect high neutron flux in these fossils where the tissue remnants are found. And so far, I can't find anything suggesting a high alpha flux in these either, so it seems like a non-issue. Of course, once again, creationists are welcome to just do the work to find evidence of high alpha flux in these fossils. It's just that they seem not to have done it, and possibly because most of them aren't Thomas Kindell, the only person I've ever heard mention this.
So this appears to be extremely powerful evidence that in as good a shape as these soft tissues, cell structures, and proteins are,
which is to say, actually not very good at the molecular level. While they often retain the approximate shape and color of the original tissue, at the molecular level they are severely degraded. The heme molecules that give the reddish color to the blood have been reduced to much smaller porphyrin molecules which retain the color, but are certainly not the highly complex proteins from which they are derived. Similarly, the collagen that has been found is cross-linked, which is itself a change, but also broken up into smaller subunits than the original collagen would have been broken into. These are not intact molecules that are being found, not by a long shot.
They can be no more than just several thousand years old.
You know, earlier he was saying several hundreds of thousands of years old.
Agreeing powerfully with what the Bible teaches, that no more than about 5,000 years ago they were buried, living at the same time, buried by the great Genesis flood.
There it is. He has to lie about even what he himself said, because hundreds of thousands of years is still too much too old for his mythology. Nothing says this is all made up to soothe his cognitive dissonance, like changing the numbers within this very talk that he himself gave, just to provide aid and comfort to his dogmas. Could it be any more obvious that this is all just intellectually dishonest and not concerned in the least with what's actually true?
And that's why they're still intact. They simply haven't been around or in the ground long enough to completely deteriorate as they should have if they're millions of years old.
It's just too bad none of that actually checks out when there's something to check out, and that some of it seems to just be made up. Not so much on the spot, but perhaps while preparing the slides for this. Really, I'm pretty sure he just made up the alpha particle thing.
Now, I quote here the evolutionists Collins and Buckley.
Interestingly, this quotation is from before Schweitzer's 2013 cross-linking paper, so they cannot have taken into account one of the primary preservation mechanisms. I wonder if Kindell has checked the timeline on this.
Who have done a lot of research and published a lot of peer-reviewed research on how long it takes for proteins, and especially really tough protein like collagen, to break down.
Too bad we didn't get anything from them from after the 2013 study. I wonder if it's because after that they accepted the study showing that there were preservation mechanisms that they had not before explored.
And they did this originally in relation to archaeological sites in Great Britain. Yeah, they're both British scientists. And of course, archaeological sites are considered to be during the time of man and no more than several thousand years old.
Well, some of them are actually tens of thousands of years old, although at that point, the line between archaeology and paleoanthropology can get a bit blurry.
Therefore, finding proteins and collagen, things like that, intact, largely intact, was not a problem.
It also, of course, means that most of what they're doing isn't really all that similar to the environments in which pristine fossils are found, since that tends to be places like anoxic lagoons and bogs, places where humans tend not to put cemeteries. But hey, who cares about depositional environment? And yeah, under most circumstances, I'm sure that tens of thousands of years is enough to degrade things like collagen. There's a reason the vast majority of fossils have no molecular soft tissue preservation.
Because even thermodynamics and ground radiation would not have broken them down that much in just a few thousand years. So they published all this data where they showed that with the experiments, with the Arrhenius equations, plotting it out, they said it would take between 0.2 and 0.7 million years. In other words, 200,000 to 700,000 years.
Look at that, a creationist getting math right instead of being 5 to 7 orders of magnitude off. That's neat. But also, let's read what the optimal environment that was used was. This is from the paper he cited. Quote, to simulate the thermal degradation of type 1 collagen, samples of modern cattle, Bos taurus, and human, Homo sapiens bone pieces were heated in sealed Pyrex glass vials under wet conditions, 10 milliliter distilled water, 1 gram bone, at 90 degrees Celsius, for a maximum duration of 32 days. 7 subsamples, including 5 milliliters of the supernatant, were taken after 1, 2, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 26, and 32 days of incubation. After heating, the vials were cooled, decanted, and lyophilized for subsequent amino acid analysis steps. So, no iron or other potential preservative. Of course, this does not actually account for any of the circumstances proposed to preserve these tissues. Should we really be surprised that a paper published before the first paper proposing a preservation mechanism, and which did not include any preservatives, resulted in a decay rate for collagen that's much faster than we would see in, say, a T-Rex femur from which Dr. Schweitzer collected collagen remnants? And further, let's remember that technically, no collagen has ever been found in a Mesozoic dinosaur skeleton. Instead, what is found are broken down collagen remnants, cross-linked collagen-derived molecules. So even if this were applicable, since we aren't finding actual collagen in the first place, technically this wouldn't even be a contradiction.
Average of 450,000 years at 10 degrees Celsius, which is only about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where levels of collagen to fall to just 1% in an optimum burial environment.
Well, I guess now we know that despite citing this paper, Kindell didn't seem to read it, since in fact the tests were done in water. Oops. Now I'm going to be fair, I didn't read the whole thing either, I just read the first page and the whole methods section. But all I wanted was the methods, and just that was enough to know what they tested. Kindell didn't even get that part right.
Now, optimum means no microbes eating it up, no excess of oxygen or water. So even in the optimum environment, it's going to break down by thermodynamics at these relatively cool temperatures in just several 100,000 years.
Yeah, in the absence of any preservative method. That's true. Good thing we have methods to preserve the molecules, and of course they broke down anyway. Just not so much as to be unrecognizable.
More recent experiments done with the F-tier microscopy devices.
Weird then how they're called F-tier. What do S-tier microscopes do?
Which are much more sophisticated and can measure much more accurately than the devices used by Collins and Buckley years ago, indicates it's breaking down actually about twice as fast as what they measured.
You know, that's weird, because this kind of measurement isn't done by a microscope at all, normally. In fact, in the paper itself, the measurements were taken by matrix-assisted laser desorption ionization time-of-flight mass spectrometry, or MALDI-TOFMS, in reflection mode. That's not a microscope. I reiterate my belief that Kindle did not actually read this paper. I suspect he found the quotation in the work of some other, more popular creationist, and simply stole the quote without ever checking the paper. Seems pretty shady, but also if a microscope shows that these are breaking down twice as fast, then why did the spectrometry from Buckley and Collins detect higher rates of preservation? Mass spectrometry is a far more sophisticated and accurate way to measure small amounts of chemicals such as proteins than a microscope could ever be. I doubt the experiments he's talking about even exist, but I would expect them to be far less sensitive and accurate even if they did. Microscopes just aren't how you look for traces of chemicals.
You can reduce that down to about 225,000 years. Even for tough proteins like collagen, and the less tough ones, which are almost all the rest of them, would last even much less than that. Powerful evidence.
So far, the entirety of his evidence has been a paper from before the paper that actually gave one of the current explanations that didn't test anything relevant. That's not what I would call powerful.
That the Bible is true, that all those creatures' remains are only thousands of years old, and simply this evidence should not exist if it's anywhere near as old as what they claim.
Wow. It's amazing what creationists will accept as evidence that their interpretation of the Bible is true. Literal made-up bullshit and lies about papers. It's almost like they're desperate because their beliefs are very obviously false and shouldn't be taken seriously. But they don't like that.
We also have the problem that carbon-14 disappears rapidly. It has a relatively rapid half-life of only 5,730 years.
I guess that's rapid compared to some half-lives, but it's also glacially slow compared to others. But I don't know if that matters.
Which means in 10 half-lives, about 57,000 years, less than 60,000 years, there's not much left. And you get much past 100,000 years, it'd be very difficult to detect any of it.
It depends on the initial sample, but yes, in most circumstances, much past 50,000 years, any organic sample will have a carbon-14 presence that's too low to distinguish from background noise, which will never be zero. And now I realize he's almost certainly going to find examples of samples of known ages, point out that the background noise carbon-14 reading was found, and then, because creationists pretend that that's finding carbon-14 in the samples, he's going to say that really the fossils are much younger. Let's hope I'm wrong about that.
Yet in all these specimens where they took rigorous measures to rule out the possibility of contamination, they found in a hadrosaur dinosaur, a Montosaurus specimen, a Pharodeus specimen, another hadrosaur, a Triceratops, ancient axlewood, drumheller wood, etc., which is supposed to be, again, millions of years old. They all had very measurable amounts of carbon-14.
So this is all taken from Radiocarbon in Dinosaur and Other Fossils by longtime antagonists to truth Brian Thomas and Vance Nelson in the Creation Research Quarterly in 2015. And it is true that most of these were probably actual detection of carbon-14 in these fossils, but the question is, did it actually come from these organisms in question, or is it extrinsic carbon-14 that comes from known sources? Well, let's see what else Kindle has for us.
And it usually falls in the parameters of about 20 to 45,000 years. Most of them fall within that range.
Most of the ones I see are in excess of 40,000 years, and I don't think Kindle has done a survey on this. I think he's just basing it on this one Brian Thomas source. I must say, though, that it is nice to actually be able to read a source from Kindle. It's even linked in the description. I think this might be the first time he's cited anything properly. And by properly, I don't mean with perfect citation formatting or anything. Just cited with enough information that I can find the exact source he's using. That's all I ask for.
No matter how far up and down the geological column you go, they all seem to have about the same amount of carbon-14 in them.
Ironically, this is not true in the results we're shown, as the overall trend in the Thomas source is in fact that fossils from higher in the stratigraphic column actually do tend to give younger ages in Thomas results, although the correlation isn't great, and I suspect a wider survey would probably reveal a more or less random distribution of ages. This should itself cause pause, since in archaeological context, creationists tend to accept carbon dating, meaning that if it is in their mind at least reliable enough within the last couple thousand years, and should at least be good for relative, if not absolute, dating beyond that. But since these fossils don't tend to neatly fall into a chronological order, that should mean, on the basis of young Earth creationism, that in fact what is being measured here is not age. The other option, of course, is that young Earth creationists can simply get rid of their trust in carbon dating wholesale, but then that would remove some of the archaeological evidence for the historicity of various parts of the Bible that they actually do want to accept. What a quandary. Luckily for them, intellectual honesty and having internally consistent beliefs aren't exactly a priority for the average young Earth creationist, so it doesn't really matter for them.
Interestingly, some animals don't absorb it at the same rate, but close enough to it so that you'd have a little wiggle room there.
I'm not sure what he means by this. I suspect he might be talking about things like the fact that organisms near industrial sources of carbon dioxide emissions, or near nuclear blasts, or who just live in the ocean, often give incorrect dates when these factors are not taken into account. Because these sources of carbon dioxide are not representative of the concentration of carbon-14 in the atmosphere broadly as caused by radiation from space. Interestingly, these are all called out in one of the only non-creationist sources cited by Thomas. Carbon background. Does it have multiple personalities? By M.J. Nadeau. Also, Thomas cites Andrew Snelling at least 6 times to give you an idea of the quality of research we're talking about here. Casually citing a known liar like Andrew Snelling isn't exactly a good sign.
But none of them should have any detectable carbon-14 in them after a bit over 100,000 years.
Wrong.
None of them should have detectable carbon-14 from the organism, and there's no reason to think that any of them do. But there are numerous reasons to suspect all of them, maybe except the Captorinus, had carbon-14 from other sources. This is especially true since, other than one sample, that's ironically not even on Kindell's slide, there's no reason to think any original biological material from the organism was left, meaning that no matter how old the fossils are, no matter what Thomas et fam measured, it sure wasn't carbon-14 that could establish an age for these fossils.
Theoretically, after 250,000 years, there simply wouldn't be a single atom of carbon-14 that had not decayed back into nitrogen-14.
That's not how math works. A half-life describes an exponential decay rate, such that after one half-life, half the original sample will have decayed, after 2 half-lives, 3/4 of it will have decayed, after 3 half-lives, 7/8 of it will have decayed, and so on. The expected remainder as a fraction of the original sample that will be undecayed after a given time can be given with the formula 1/2 to the n, where n is the number of half-lives that have passed. 250,000 is about 4.4 half-lives of carbon-14, so if we plug that into the formula, we find that after 250,000 years, there should be about 4.737% of the original carbon-14 left. That's not none.
So there simply wouldn't be anything to measure after just 250,000 years.
Fun fact, there are actually no numbers you can put in as the exponent that will give you an expected remaining fraction of 0. Now, in real life, there will be a final carbon-14 nucleus which will decay, but how long that will take is not something that can be simply calculated, as spontaneous nuclear decay is, in fact, stochastic, not deterministic.
But we find very measurable amounts. Now, why do they vary between about 20 to 45,000 years? I believe is because the evolutionists don't take into account the fact that in the recent past, the Earth's magnetic field was several times more powerful than it is today.
I don't see how that's going to matter. The flood was only about a year long. The alleged magnetic field shenanigans would probably have taken less time than that, and so I don't see why that would scramble up the radiocarbon ages of a bunch of organisms who died in the flood, all presumably likely within weeks, and not more than months apart. Anything to do with the magnetic field reducing the rate of production of carbon-14 should be uniform across everything that died in the flood, and only start affecting organisms after the amount of atmospheric carbon-14 starts to appreciably increase in size, and then settle at a new higher equilibrium.
The rapid decay of the Earth's magnetic field is a globally tracked phenomenon going on for almost 200 years now.
For about that time, there has been a general decay in the overall strength of the dipole moment of the geomagnetic field, but we have a paleomagnetic record going back much farther than the period of time that humans have been directly measuring the geomagnetic field. It shows that, in fact, the current decline is one of many cycles of weakening, reversal, strengthening, and then back to weakening before another reversal. Scientists actually have a pretty good record of tens of millions of years worth of magnetic field reversals with attendant weakening and strengthening. Even if we were to compress this to fit into a young Earth timeline, it would not be the case that we could say that there is a general weakening trend in the strength of any component of the geomagnetic field.
And it indicates an exponential decay with a half-life of about 1,400 years.
I love the creationist tendency to take things that we know not to be constant, or even to have a general trend, and extrapolate the currently observed rate indefinitely into the past. They do this with things like the decay of biomolecules, the change in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, the rate of coastal and other kinds of erosion, etc. But when it comes to things that we have every reason to think physically cannot be varied in any significant ways, like the rate of spontaneous decay of various unstable nuclides, the maximum deposition rate of shale or lime, etc., then suddenly we can just imagine any old changes to that rate, whatever is convenient at the time. Could it be more obvious how much they hate science?
So 1,400 years ago was twice as powerful. 2,800 years ago was 4 times as powerful. Get on back to the time before the flood, it was several times more powerful, and it does deflect cosmic rays, which is what produces carbon-14 by bombarding nitrogen-14 in the Earth's atmosphere.
Well, it's what produces atmospheric carbon-14, which is the source we're usually talking about when we talk about carbon dating. But remember, these fossils don't have any of the original carbon in them, which means that the source can't be directly from the atmosphere. So how did they get the carbon-14? Well, one way is that new carbon-14 can be created by the decay products of uranium interacting with boron-14 and oxygen-14 to create carbon-14. You see, fossils actually tend to concentrate environmental uranium, because for various reasons they tend to accumulate any uranium that enters the environment, whereas the surrounding matrix tends not to retain it. This means that on this basis alone, a permineralized fossil will often be radioactive, and also have carbon-14 that is being generated within the fossil. There are also a couple other sources of new carbon-14. One big one is that sometimes fossils are contaminated whether by new biogenic material from recent bacteria, or even just from coal, which is where at least one of the Thomas samples was found. Further, new crystals can precipitate from dissolved minerals in water and then grow on or even in the fossils, and such minerals can be quite recent and contain carbon-14.
So at the time before the flood, less carbon-14 was being produced. So when animals died and were buried in the flood, they had less carbon-14 in them than animals that died today.
Which should result in a fairly uniform radiocarbon age for all flood fossils. But that's not what we find. It's amazing that since he is not beholden to evidence or even plausibility, he can just make up anything to explain this, and yet the thing he makes up doesn't explain it. He must be a very special kind of stupid.
Because the Earth's magnetic field isn't as strong today, and therefore more production of carbon-14 takes place because more cosmic rays get through to cause that production.
It is true that a stronger magnetic field would deflect more cosmic rays and reduce the production of carbon-14.
So they assume that the current rate of carbon-14, which is about a 1 trillion to 1 ratio of normal carbon-12 to carbon-14, that has been the same for millions of years.
Nope, that is not a claim or assumption that is made. First, since for most of the history of Earth the strength of the magnetic field is irrelevant since it was too long ago to matter to radiocarbon dating, we can just disregard that. But for the relevant parts, the paleomagnetic record is consulted, as are other methods of dating such as electron spin resonance, dendrochronology, and ice core dating. From this, a correction curve can be constructed that takes into account the variations in the amount of atmospheric carbon-14 through time. These corrections go into what's called a calibration curve. So let's see how this works at a basic level. If we do some math, we can get a formula to solve for the number of half-lives that involve some logarithmic shenanigans and whatnot. But anyway, that is the equation that can be used to solve for the age of the sample in the naive case that assumes constant modern levels of atmospheric radiocarbon. This number is then compared to the calibration curve to account for the long-term changes in atmospheric carbon concentration, and that is how the actual date is measured. Tom here hasn't discovered one neat trick scientists don't want you to know about. This is already well-known, publicly discussed, and accounted for in science.
And therefore, when they see less carbon-14 than what animals have that die today, they assume there's been some half-lives of decay.
It's not an assumption, it's checked. The work has been done and is being refined. This alleged problem isn't news to anyone working in carbon dating. Like all measurement techniques, it has known error margins and limitations. No one is pretending otherwise.
That's why these give measurable ages, but they measure, anywhere from 20 to 45,000 or so years.
Which again wouldn't actually be explained by his proposed mechanism, since his mechanism would result in largely uniform ages. But the mechanisms of contamination, recrystallization of carbonaceous minerals, and the new production of carbon-14 from radioactive processes in the ground all result in variable amounts of carbon-14, which is probably why those are the actual explanations that scientists generally accept.
It's because they don't take into account the fact that these creatures had less carbon-14 in them when they died because of the stronger magnetic field at the time before the flood.
I've already gone over this. The fluctuations in the magnetic field are indeed taken into account.
But the big problem, the big problem is there shouldn't be any measurable carbon-14 at all.
Incorrect.
And we don't just find it in dinosaur bones, we find it in things even in the Cambrian, ancient wood and things like that.
Turns out that the known processes that can introduce younger carbon into fossils are going on today, regardless of how old the fossil is. I would expect that Cambrian fossils would also have some amount of carbon-14 detected. Of course, let's not also forget that creationists routinely actually do fail to find carbon-14 in fossils, getting dates back that are identical to when a control is used, and they just report those as real ages anyway. So Kendall is actually being somewhat more reasonable than most creationists are on this topic, and it still doesn't help him.
Now, here we have a radiocarbon in dinosaur bones at an international conference back in 2012 that was censored in the Philippines.
As it says on his slide, which is just a screen grab from Creation.com, the meeting was in Singapore, which is its own country and not a part of the Philippines. Singapore is its own country. It's one I've been to. I even ate jellyfish and went to church there. Ultimately, this doesn't matter much, but it shows the overall pattern of just not caring if what is said is true.
And a team of German researchers gave a presentation at the 2012 Western Pacific Geophysics meeting in Singapore.
A talk that is still on YouTube as of the time of this writing, although the audio quality is atrocious. The presentation is allegedly by one Dr. Thomas Seiler, who seems to be a young Earth creationist associated with the Catholic Young Earth creationist organization, the Colby Center, who I've covered before. Most of the talk is just presenting charts that display data from his dating of various dinosaur fossils. Most show above background signals, which is not unexpected or particularly significant. He concludes that contamination is unlikely, which does not seem to have been just accepted, and also does not address all of the possibilities for his low but significant carbon-14 finds.
August 13 through 17, at which they gave carbon-14 dating results from many bone samples from 8 dinosaur specimens, and they took all the rigorous protocol to eliminate the possibility of contamination.
Well, they claim to have done so, but they did not actually present their full methods, so we can't actually say that they did so successfully. But they also did not even mention things like the creation of new carbon-14 from the decay of uranium and subsequent interactions with boron and oxygen nuclei. So even if we do accept their claim at face value, that only accounts for some of the potential sources of carbon-14, other than that it was intrinsic to the biological components of the dinosaur in question. Now, to be fair, it's a 16-minute presentation, and I wouldn't expect that in that time they would have time to go into every single detail, but as it is, the presentation isn't exactly stunning evidence of the young age of dinosaur bones. It's not even really anything new. It took place well after the Brian Thomas source Kendall used before, as well as well after various responses, including one article by Philip Center about this, which I have relied on in this video.
Which is the only main argument that they use.
Weird, because the first source I found for this from a non-creationist author had 2 other arguments, but okay.
It's been contaminated with Martin radiocarbon. They didn't really have that. When you rule out the possibility of contamination, they don't know what to say.
Well, that's just not true. I'm not even in this field, and I had something to say right away.
And so they resort to censorship.
They must be really bad at censorship, since I was able to watch the entire presentation within 5 minutes of learning that it existed, simply by finding the Creation.com article and following its link to the talk. I can't find any evidence of censorship, really. The CMI article says that it is not included on an archived version of the schedule. Of course, much of that archived schedule is missing. However, I'm not sure if that explains it. But this sent me down something of a rabbit hole. You see, the guy giving the talk, one Dr. Thomas Seiler, as I've said, doesn't seem to exist. Now, that's not to say that a man answering to that name did not give this presentation. I saw it happen in a video. The only 2 places I can find any mention of a Dr. Thomas Seiler in connection to anything to do with geology or evolutionary biology is in reference to this talk and one debate with a priest hosted by the Colby Center. The latter seems not to exist anymore, as any time I've tried to listen to it, the page has failed to load. But further, it seems that no one named Thomas Seiler has ever gotten a PhD anywhere. There are no papers with such a person as the author. The paper on which this talk was largely based has not been published anywhere that I can find, and further, it seems that multiple of the samples being talked about in the talk were from the collection of Carl Baugh. Now, am I saying that Carl Baugh made up a scientist, got some guy to pretend to be that guy, then that guy wormed his way into a science conference in Singapore to talk some nonsense to a small group of gathered scientists? Well, no, but also that's where all the signs seem to be pointing. So another much more likely scenario is that this talk was removed from the schedule after it was discovered that the speaker was lying about who he was and what his credentials were.
And so this was presented in the symposium. It was on the internet.
It still is on the internet.
And some of these people took it upon themselves to remove it permanently.
Yeah, knowing what I know now, that seems appropriate. I would expect that someone lying about who they were would be grounds for removing their talk, as would, honestly, any association with Carl Baugh that isn't antagonistic. Everything that guy touches turns out to be a fraud of some kind or another, generally academic and not financial or legal, although given what friend of the channel Chrissy Hansen has turned up about him, I wouldn't rule out the other two either.
Without even asking the presenters or asking even the sponsors of the symposium.
What evidence is there that neither the sponsors nor the speaker were contacted? I haven't seen evidence that they were, but that's not the same as evidence that they were not. Right now, I don't know if they were contacted, and I have formed no belief on the matter. Kindell should do the same, or present the evidence he must have seen to convince him that they were not contacted.
They took it upon themselves as judge, jury, and executioner to get rid of it. That tells me this is powerful evidence.
And it tells me that they probably felt betrayed by someone violating the general rules about openness and honesty that are core to the scientific endeavor. Remember, when people are either not open or not honest, we get debacles like cold fusion and Archaeoraptor. So while I don't really know what happened in this instance, the preponderance of the evidence leans towards this being a creationist fraud, more than it does towards some scared biologist or geologist censoring the amazing evidence of a young Earth, which has not since been published in the years since. And it's doubly on that side, since the evidence was just trust me bro, there was no contamination, and no attempt to rule out other sources of carbon-14.
If they could debate it publicly and refute it, they would.
That's true.
And in fact they have. One of my sources is Radiocarbon and Dinosaur Fossils Compatibility with an Age of Millions of Years, published in 2020 and written by Philip J. Center, a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences in Fayetteville State University in North Carolina. It is a direct refutation of these claims, not those of the man going by Dr. Seiler directly, but of the whole idea that radiocarbon and dinosaur fossils is a problem for science.
Because they figured they couldn't, the only other option is censorship, and that's exactly what they did.
It's almost like Kindell here has never actually searched the literature to see if this has been addressed. Isn't that odd?
So at the bottom here, the quote is what I'm looking at. At the top, we're talking about the buildup of carbon-14 in the atmosphere. That's another evidence for young age, but we're not specifically talking about that.
It's not evidence of a young age, because we have records of atmospheric carbon-14 in ice cores going back longer than Kindell thinks the Earth has been around, and it has more or less been at equilibrium for the whole time despite fluctuations. There is no sudden increase in radiation in the upper atmosphere, followed by a buildup from more or less no carbon-14 to current rates. The graph is not showing measurements, it's just a made-up curve that illustrates his fairy tale.
That is covered in my DVD, Scientific Evidence for Young Age of the Earth.
Oh, he hawks DVDs. They might actually work as something to fall asleep to, if nothing else. His voice is soothing, provided the audio quality is good, unlike here.
But at the bottom, I point out that every sample of coal, oil, wood, or bone that has been tested for carbon-14 content, even if retrieved from rocks supposedly millions of years old.
And in those cases, the bone and wood aren't even going to be bone or wood, so no original carbon from the organism will be present, meaning that this carbon-14 cannot be intrinsic, but okay.
Always contains a measurable amount of carbon-14.
That's not actually true. Those creationists routinely report findings of carbon-14 that are beyond the ability of test equipment to distinguish from background, meaning that they actually cannot say with any confidence that carbon-14 was found in those samples. Also, if he thinks carbon-14 concentrations were zero before the flood, then organisms that died almost at any point in the flood should have essentially no time to incorporate measurable amounts of carbon-14 into their bodies. And so all should read the maximum carbon-14 age, and only post-flood organisms should have any carbon-14 above background. Kindell's ideas here are logically inconsistent, meaning that really, they don't actually rise to the level of ideas.
And that should never be the case, but it is always the case, and it's because all of these creatures were buried at the time of the flood, just several thousands of years ago.
It is very strange to me that he can't even predict the actual test results if his idea were correct. His idea requires there to be C14 already in the atmosphere before the flood, and for there not to be, and for animals during the flood to incorporate wildly different amounts of carbon-14 into their biology through no known mechanism, since breathing and eating won't cut it in less than a year. There is just no there. This isn't an alternative explanation for the findings of carbon-14 in dinosaur fossils. This is just the fever dream of a very stupid man.
And they had less carbon-14 in them, but it's still there, because it's only been several thousand years, and not the 100,000 years or so that it takes for it to disappear.
Then we would get consistent dates, since all of these organisms in the fossil record died within a year of each other. We don't.
Now, another major problem is the discovery of desiccated, intact dinosaurs.
So on screen is the Brachylophosaurus canadensis specimen known as Leonardo, which is the permineralized remains of a mummified dinosaur. It preserved previously unknown soft tissue, like a crop in the throat, much like that of birds, the keratinous beak, possibly a tongue, and gut contents.
Where their skin and their intestines and even the contents of their intestines are still intact.
Yep.
These aren't really fossilized, they simply dried out and mummified.
Wrong.
They are, in fact, permineralized. When you look at Leonardo, you are looking at a rock in the shape of the soft tissue. No part of Leonardo's body is known to be original to the animal itself.
And this has been found around the world, but one of the most exquisite cases was found up in Canada.
Actually, it's found almost never, almost nowhere. And the fact that both of his examples are North American late Cretaceous dinosaurs should probably be a hint that he's wrong that this happens all over the world. In fact, Leonardo and the Borealopelta mummy in the Royal Tyrrell Museum are basically the only two such finds ever made for a Mesozoic dinosaur.
Canada unveils a dinosaur mummy found with skin and gut contents intact.
Well, intact is a bit of an exaggeration for the skin. The skin is intact across the dorsal surface of the find, but the limbs and the ventral side are missing, meaning that, in fact, the skin is not intact. This is probably because the animal washed out to sea and fell to the bottom of a shallow sea upside down, since the dorsal side is more dense, what with being covered with bony armor plates. This means that the limbs and ventral surface were probably exposed for longer and thus were not preserved.
As it says in the upper right-hand corner there, since that lucky moment, it has taken researchers 7,000 hours over the course of the past 6 years to both test the remains and prepare them for display.
Paleontology is a lot of work.
At the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada, which I believe in Alberta, Canada. If you ever get up there, you might want to take a look at it in person.
Agreed, the Royal Tyrrell Museum is one of the coolest museums I've never managed to get to. In fact, I think I've only been to 2 museums in Canada, the Royal BC Museum in Victoria, British Columbia, and Le Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montréal in Montreal, Quebec. Both were great, and I recommend both, although my recommendation comes from not having been to either in well over a decade, so maybe they suck now. I doubt it, though.
Where visitors now have the chance to see the closest thing to a real-life dinosaur that the world has ever likely seen.
Well, that's silly. I can hardly go outside during the day and not see at least a dozen or so living dinosaurs. I'm really wondering what about this find is such a problem for science, though. Kendall seems not interested in telling us anything beyond that the find is cool, which is admittedly true.
Well, there it is, my friends. Intact bone, intact cartilage, intact proteins.
I cannot find any reports of any proteins, let alone intact proteins, in this fossil. Mass spectrometry was used to confirm the existence of preserved melanin, but melanin is not a protein. It is a particularly sturdy organic compound, but it is not a polymer of amino acids, which is what a protein is by definition. If Kendall has a report of protein recovery from this fossil, then he should probably cite it. As is, I have to conclude that this is yet another lie.
Skin intact, the melanin proteins intact, the guts.
Well, at least now we know that he's stupid and not just a liar on this. Melanin is not a protein. Finding it does not mean you found a protein. There's a fair chance that you watching this also did not know that melanin is not a protein, but that's okay. The difference is that you're not going around getting chemistry wrong in hopes of causing the downfall of the basis of modern society. Kendall is. I have higher standards for him, and yet he fails to live up to even the lower standards I would hold other people to who are not pretending to teach these things.
Dried out but intact, and we can tell what it ate for its last meal. That's intact.
Well, it is true that the melanin is pretty intact, as are the gut contents. It's just that that's not protein, nor is it inexplicable. Like, I really want to know what the argument is. Is it that some fossils are exceptionally well preserved, therefore a flood? I mean, no matter what caused fossils to form, there would always be a spectrum of level of preservation, and cherry-picking 2 of them that are at the high end of the spectrum doesn't seem to be an argument for or against the flood. All
of this should have degraded into the finest dust by thermodynamic breakdown and by radiation bombardment within at most a few 100,000 years.
Nope, melanin is incredibly robust and can last basically forever. And the rest of this is rock, not tissue. Rock can also basically last forever. Nothing in this find even counts as soft tissue preservation at the chemical level. There has been no recovery of proteins here, so even if we didn't have a good explanation for the chemical preservation of protein remnants like those that Dr. Schweitzer found, this fossil isn't an example of that anyway.
There should be nothing but the finest dust.
Rock can survive a very long time. This is made of rock.
Instead, we have this largely intact Ankylosaurus-type dinosaur.
Specifically, it is a notosaurid ankylosaur. Nodosauridae is the sister group to Ankylosauridae, and the easiest way to tell them apart is that Ankylosaurids had tail clubs, and Nodosaurids do not.
Which they claim to be 110 million years old. Now in the world, did it survive thermodynamic breakdown and ground radiation bombardment for that time?
It didn't. It just got turned to stone, because this is a permineralized fossil with no soft tissue preservation beyond permineralization of some of the skin and keratin, which itself preserved one category of non-protein biomolecule that is already incredibly robust and about as long-lasting as the rock itself. The only reason to think that this couldn't last 110 million years is if you think rocks can't last that long. But there's no reason to think that.
Well, they have no idea. They just claim that we found a number of these, and isn't it amazing, that it doesn't refute evolution because we say so.
No one said that, because there's no reason to even suspect that this could refute evolution. Nothing about this is out of line with any known science, evolution included. It's just rare and cool, but that's it. Literally nothing here poses even as much of a challenge as Schweitzer's collagen remnants. Like, the only argument he's presented is that there are preserved proteins, which there are not. So what do we have left? Just a really well-preserved dinosaur.
Well, saying it doesn't make it so.
Boy, is that something Kindell should take on board himself.
Prove how it could survive thermodynamic breakdown and ground radiation breakdown, then maybe you could have some credibility, but just denying it and saying, well, other evolutionists say it can last that long doesn't prove it at all.
Okay, I'm skipping the rest of what he has to say about Borealopelta, since he's just fundamentally wrong about what melanin is, and that's his only argument. He just goes on to keep saying how it can't be so intact and how freshly dead it looks. We'll pick back up with him discussing radiometric dating more broadly.
Now, the evolutionists, those that are honest, realize that using a stage of evolution to build the geological column is using the assumption of evolution, therefore it's invalid due to circular reasoning.
And isn't how the stratigraphic column was or is constructed anyway, so hooray.
So they need an independent means of verifying the age of the rocks and the fossils.
Well, stratigraphy is independent, it's just relative. Radiometric dating is absolute, which is nice. Remember, relative dating just tells you which strata are older and younger than which other strata. But absolute dating, even if it's wrong, returns an age with a number and a unit of time, like 50 million years, plus or minus 3 million.
And they claim that radioisotope dating does that independently, but it is not true.
Big claim.
Because it's another form of circular reasoning, because only the assumptions that fit the pre-arranged geological timetable are allowed to be printed and accepted in the textbooks and in the research.
There are no untested assumptions in radiometric dating as a technique. Like, literally none. The only assumption that comes even close is that of induction, that we can use past experience to predict future experience. But that's like the bedrock of science. Without that, literally all of science falls apart because it becomes impossible to test hypotheses.
If radioisotope dating contradicted what they already agreed upon in the geological column, it simply would not be used.
But it already did that. Before radiometric dating, the general consensus in geology was that the Earth was probably not more than a few tens of millions of years old. Instead, radiometric dating showed that it was far, far older, and that was accepted despite overturning the general sedimentologically derived age. It's almost like Kindell never bothered to actually look into the history of things like geology, paleontology, biological evolution, thermodynamics, etc.
But it has so many assumptions. They call it absolute dating, which is an absolute crock.
All that means is that it gives you a measurement with a magnitude and a unit. It's not a crock, it might be inaccurate, even worthless, but it's still absolute.
It has many unverifiable assumptions which can be easily manipulated to make it fit whatever date they want, and they already know what date they want because they've already figured out the geological column.
Actually, no, it can't just be manipulated, whatever that means. But even if that were true, that wouldn't make it not an absolute dating method. I suspect Kindell doesn't actually know what absolute means in this context. I think he means that it's absolutely true, or absolutely reliable, which is not what it means at all. It contrasts, in this case, with relative.
Before radioisotope dating was ever even discovered.
Except that radiometric dating actually pushed back our estimates of the age of the Earth by about 2 orders of magnitude, because science actually is about following the evidence where it leads, and before radiometric dating, there wasn't really a reason to think it led to billions of years. But when radiometric dating showed that actually some rocks on Earth are billions of years old, geologists ended up taking that on board and applying such ages to previously established but incorrectly dated strata. And by incorrectly dated, I mean in terms of the estimates as to their absolute age. The relative ages of the strata were well confirmed, since they were based on the so far basically unchallenged laws of stratigraphy laid down by Steno, as previously discussed.
So they already have their theory, they already have the order of the fossils, they already have the general dates of the ages.
Nope, only the first two.
Radioisotope dating is just window dressing for public relations.
This man has a copium line going directly into his bloodstream. He is mainlining cope. And of course, even if he were right, guess what? That would just be a successful prediction by scientists about the age of the Earth. So he's wrong, but even if he were right, then far from that being bad, it would be, if anything, evidence that geologists in the past were better at their jobs than they had any right to be. When a new technique comes by and confirms your predictions, that's a W. If he wants to frame it as an L, well, that's a weird choice.
To make it look like they're not using circular reasoning, when in fact they still are, because the theory of evolution still takes precedent over radioisotope dating, in so much as radioisotope dating is never now allowed to contradict what they already agreed on about the age.
Nope. There is no checkbox or blank on a form for how old you want a sample to be. Nor does it have anything to do with evolution, except that it doesn't contradict evolution, because, spoiler, both the ancient age of the Earth and evolution are true. Basically, he's just not happy that independent lines of evidence about the past all converge on about the same answer, and that it's an answer he just doesn't like and wants to reject. Well, tough shit. This convergence isn't a conspiracy, and by proposing one, he now has to actually show evidence for the conspiracy. But since this isn't the first time he's proposed a conspiracy in science, and he has yet to ever show any evidence for any conspiracy, we can just ignore the conspiracy claim until he does show evidence, which we all know he won't.
But it has three major assumptions. One is a constant decay rate, which has turned out to be strong evidence against that.
The strong evidence against that amounts to wishful thinking by creationists and nothing more. In reality, varying the rate at which various nuclides undergo spontaneous nuclear decay requires changing fundamental forces of nature, like the strong and weak nuclear forces. It is physically impossible to do. These rates are unaffected by physical circumstances except for going at relativistic speeds, which would only slow down the observed rate. There is no way to increase that rate that is even conceivable within physics as we understand it. Now, induced decay from things like beta or neutron capture can indeed be sped up by increasing the flux of the particle that is interacting with the nuclei in question. But radiometric dating does not use induced decay processes for this very reason.
No loss or gain of the parent or daughter isotopes. In other words, no contamination or leaching taking place.
Depending on technique, that is in fact impossible, or checked for. In many cases, like uranium-lead testing in zircons, lead is chemically excluded and the crystals are so hard and long-lasting that we can know that there was no significant change in these. And further techniques, like isochron dating, can check for such leaching into or out of the rock directly, and even further, rocks that have had events happen to them that can cause such leaching, as a rule, have metamorphosed in detectable ways, and so are not suitable candidates for radiometric dating in the first place.
To disrupt those ratios and the known amounts of daughter product present at the start.
Again, that is often known and can be checked on. For example, if you're looking for argon as a daughter, well, argon doesn't really form chemical bonds, so it isn't incorporated into crystals as they form. So in many cases, we don't need to check on this unless Kendall is going to propose that in addition to changing the strong and weak nuclear forces that control spontaneous decay, that there were also changes to how the electromagnetic force which governs chemistry works. And at that point, you're just changing most of the fundamental forces of the universe. Can you really say that what you're proposing is scientific and not just, well, magic? I don't think so. I think proposing, what if physics was just different one day, is proposing magic.
Now, the problem is, this is kind of like, in a rough analogy, using an hourglass to measure time. When you turn the hourglass over, it starts with all the sand in the top chamber. Then, at a measured rate, it filters down to the bottom.
Hey, Tom knows how hourglasses work. I'm sure Lord Inquisitor Torquemada Cotiaz of the Ordo Malleus of the Emperor's Most Holy Inquisition would be proud.
Brother, get the flamer. The heavy flamer.
as it does, the amount in the top decreases, and simultaneously, the amount of sand in the bottom increases. And by measuring the changing of these ratios in the top and the bottom chambers over time, you can tell how much time has passed, provided that everything stays in a closed system.
That's true.
In other words, if you had wind blowing sand into the top and into the bottom, or out of the top and out of the bottom, changing the ratio, then it wouldn't be an accurate clock. Or if the aperture that allows the sand through got bigger or smaller, allowing more sand at one time and less at another, then it would be a variable change rate.
This dude needs to make a point. So far, all of this has just been, if things are different, they would be different. Not exactly the most groundbreaking discovery.
In the hourglass, you have basically,
I'll excuse the bodily functions, not the intellectual dishonesty.
Basically a perfect closed system, which is not realistic. In the real world, groundwater penetrating through rocks can radically disrupt the ratios of parent and daughter isotopes.
If only the minerals in question are actually amenable to chemical alteration from water. Some are, some aren't. These things aren't new to geologists. They're aware of all of this. As a tip, if you, as a non-expert in a field, think you have discovered some single simple thing that will radically shake up or overturn an entire field of study that none of the experts have thought of, chances are that you're wrong. They know about it, and they have already accounted for it, and you're a little more than an annoying gnat to people who study whatever the topic is for a living.
To the effect of changing the apparent age by millions of years, even billions of years. So,
yes, it is true that if you simply ignore chemistry and physics, you can come up with reasons why radiometric dating would be consistently wrong by 5 to 7 orders of magnitude. But that's a stupid thing to do.
They really don't mind. They like having a lot of assumptions that they can easily manipulate.
That's weird, because as far as I can tell, there aren't any such assumptions in radiometric dating. You can't just manipulate the assumption that physics is what it is, which is really the main assumption of radiometric dating.
If they run the equation and they get ages too young and too old to what they want, they could say, well, there was some contamination, there was some leaching.
You might not have noticed, but what he did right there was admit that radiometric dating actually doesn't always return the expected age, but earlier he was saying that so-called assumptions are manipulated to get the right age. So why accept that a wrong age was returned by the test at all? Oh right, because there is, in fact, no conspiracy, and scientists acknowledging the limits of their measurement techniques isn't a reason to doubt the validity of the science, but quite the contrary is a reason to accept it.
These few ages that fit what they're supposed to be, those must be accurate though. So we're going to publish those.
Anomalous ages are in fact published all the time, along with proposed reasons for the anomaly. And there are even whole papers about discovering why some dates are anomalous, what caused it, how to work around whatever problems there are, etc. And further, what Kindell is suggesting is widespread systematic bias in dates that are published. That's something we can test for statistically. It's weird that no creationists who propose this conspiracy among geologists have ever bothered to present statistical evidence for any such bias. But that's because there is no such bias.
And if none of them fit, we'll assume that some of these variables caused it to be off, so we'll recalibrate the assumptions to make it fit. So with a calculation where nobody knows the real values, you can't prove it scientifically, you can put whatever you want in that equation and force it to give you whatever date you want.
Then Kindell should do that. He should get a sample, measure their isotopic ratios, and then show how he can get any possible age out of it without invoking any magic. Like, how does one propose to account for the inability of certain decay products to be chemically included in various crystals? How does he plan to deal with the fact that isochron dating means that the initial parent-to-daughter ratios are actually irrelevant in samples that can be isochron dated? How does he plan to deal with the fact that we have corroborated measured radiometric ages with historically documented volcanic events such as the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum? How will he account for the fact that rocks from the same stratigraphic position, found in vastly different parts of the world, give corresponding radiometric ages? Of course, we know he just won't do any of this. He'll just keep whining without ever putting forth even a source, never mind evidence that he's right. Remember, this isn't fundamentally about being correct. It's about getting a certain type of Christian to just kind of stop thinking about this and continue being that kind of Christian.
And of course, it always fits with evolution. So it is, again, circular reasoning.
When two independent lines of evidence converge on the same answer, that's called corroboration, not circular reasoning.
Now, to test this out, they took samples of the lava dome of Mount St. Helens, the one that actually formed in 1986.
Who did? Steve Austin? Because I'm kind of tired of addressing Steve Austin's bullshit.
And they got permits to take samples of this, I believe, in 1987. So it was about 10, 11 years at the most from the time the rocks actually formed. One of their major assumptions is that when the magma breaches the surface of the Earth and becomes a lava flow, that when it reaches the surface of the Earth, it allows these daughter isotopes to actually evaporate out.
That's like saying they make the assumption that when you pass enough electrical current through water, it creates oxygen and hydrogen gas. That's not an assumption, that's just plain old experimentally verified chemistry. Unless he has new chemistry he'd like to put forward, then that's just how it is.
So by the time the rock cools, you don't have the daughter isotopes, you have only the parent.
That depends on which daughter isotopes we're talking about and what rock we're talking about. There is no perfect one-size-fits-all radiometric technique that is appropriate in all circumstances.
So it's like setting the clock to zero. It's like turning the hourglass over, and you only have the parent that then gradually turns into the daughter.
In point of fact, in many cases, some amount of daughter material is expected, and we can measure freshly cooled rocks to see that. That's why we have things like isochron dating, which takes into account multiple parent-to-daughter pairs, their decay rates, and it is able to cancel out starting parent-to-daughter ratios, specifically because in some cases, we don't have good reason to think that little to no daughter isotope would be present in the rock when it first cooled. Everything he has to say about this is just stuff scientists are already well aware of and have already accounted for. It's like he's going into a 5-star restaurant's kitchen and reminding everyone working there how important salt is.
Now, the proof that that was a faulty assumption was they tested this lava dome that formed from lava that extruded up the top of Mount St. Helens, and it dated anywhere from a few 100,000 years to nearly 3 million years.
And depending on which technique you use, that might be correct. All measurement techniques come with a margin of error, and you can't call a measurement wrong unless you have good reason to think that the true magnitude of the value you're trying to measure lies outside the measured value plus or minus the error margin. For example, if you wanted to radiometrically date a 10-year-old volcanic rock, and the measurement you got back was 3 million years old plus or minus 4 million years old, then really, what the measurement is saying is that the rock is less than 7 million years old, which in this case is correct. Also, some measurements have a minimum value, below which they cannot reliably go. One such technique is the one used by Steve Austin, a young Earth creationist of ill repute, as if there were other kinds of repute among them, who sent off samples which suspiciously look like what Kindell is talking about, to a lab that openly stated they could not date rocks so young, and then he got back dates, all but one of which were consistent with rocks of essentially zero age that couldn't be measured. Real science isn't so simple as looking at a calendar, then noting that the date you get that way and the date that you get through counting atoms doesn't exactly match, and then declaring that really, it was all magic in the first place. That's how Kindell would like it to be, I'm sure, but that's not how anyone who cares about science would like it to be, and that's not how it is.
For a rock we know formed historically, observationally, only about 11 years previously. It should have given an age too young to even measure.
If this is the study that I'm thinking about, then that is what came back. Ages that all indicated that a rock was too young to measure given the machines that were used for the analysis.
Instead, it measured in the hundreds of thousands to millions of years.
Which for some techniques is essentially zero. It might sound like a lot of error, but when a technique is designed to detect ages in the hundreds of millions of years, an error of a few 100,000 or even a few million years is pretty minuscule.
That destroys their theory. Their methodology is fundamentally flawed.
That's some serious wishful thinking.
And it's not just in an isolated case like this. In the book, The Young Earth by Dr. John Morris.
John D. Morse is the son and successor to Henry Morse, the founder of the Institute for Creation Research, now headed up by Randy Galuza, whom I've also covered more than once here. Also, I love that the citation here is just icr.org, as if that were enough, and as if that isn't a giant webpage full of bullshit to wade through in hopes of getting this one little chart. Also, who did the typography on this? The mixing of fonts and colors is eye-searingly ugly. I hate virtually everything about this.
Who I believe may still be the president of the Institute for Creation Research. He took over after his father, Henry Morris. But I don't know if he's retired or not. But
he is in fact dead. He died in 2023. I don't know exactly when Kindell gave this talk, though, so I can't really fault him for not being a time traveler.
Anyway, he was the author of this book, and in a CD-ROM included with it, it had all this data on recent lava flows that were known of historically to be rather recent, and yet when they measured them, they gave ages of hundreds of thousands to millions of years. In fact, of course, they should not have.
So the source is a CD-ROM from a book that ICR sold who knows when from years ago. Who measured these? Where? With what techniques? Who knows? Did they even really get these results? We don't know. But what I can tell you is that in 2007, Marvin Lanfer, Dwayne Champion, Leon Meluso, and Vincenzo Mora reported in the Bulletin of Volcanology on their argon-argon dating of the pumice from Mount Vesuvius' AD 79 eruption, and got the right date, 1,925 years old plus or minus 66 years as of 2004. That means that the measured date was literally AD 79, with the earliest date being AD 13 and the latest date being AD 145. See how I did that? I told you who did it, what they did, what the result was, when they did it, and where to find it. That's called citing a source. It's something creationists seem largely incapable of doing. But also, he goes on like this for quite a while, just saying that creationists got unusual results, not citing sources, and then just asserting that because some of the most notoriously dishonest people to ever pretend to do geology may be reported incongruous dates from who knows what they did, that therefore science is actually fake. It's not a real argument, and I'm done responding to it.
Now, the RATE project, done by the Institute for Creation Research over an 8-year period,
who rather hilariously concluded that the evidence was in line with radiometric dating and that their flood model was physically impossible, but then who decided to celebrate their great success anyway. RATE is probably my favorite young Earth creationist punching bag because it was such a huge cell-phone.
RATE, as acronym, stands for Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth.
A very sloppy acronym.
And they documented in there that the production of helium as a byproduct of radioisotope decay, alpha decay.
As a quick reminder, alpha particles are in fact just helium nuclei, so anything that decays by the emission of alphas is in fact generating helium. This part is in fact accurate, and I just wanted to clarify.
Indicates that radioisotope decay must have been orders of magnitude faster in the past than what is measured today.
So Kindell doesn't really explain this much, meaning that I suppose I should. This argument is the brainchild of one Russell Humphreys. The argument is basically that he measured the rate at which helium diffuses from zircon crystals with a biotite shell with heating experiments. The measured rate of diffusion was high enough that if zircons were the ages that they are often measured to be, often billions of years old, the helium that was produced in them from alpha particle release should be mostly gone, having diffused through the crystals making up the sampled zircons. The way this works is that helium is both electrically neutral and just physically very small, meaning that it cannot be chemically bound in the crystal, and so only mechanical barriers to its escape exist. And being small, these mechanical barriers are weak, resulting in a fairly high rate of diffusion. They actually came up with two different models for this diffusion, both of which may have been designed to account for the data set that they had, but which so far have not been very successful at future predictions, or more specific predictions about helium concentrations in various parts of the crystals. But let's get a little bit more from Kindell.
If it was faster in the past, that means these large amounts that we find in the rocks are insignificant. If they got there rapidly, then a large amount does not equate to billions of years or millions of years of time.
Yep, this whole argument is to set up a mismatch between the evident amount of decay in the zircons versus the time such decay must have happened in. The argument is that if the decay happened rapidly, then the zircon should have relatively abundant helium, and if it did not, then it should be depleted in helium. Since according to Humphreys, the zircons have the amount of helium he might predict for a young Earth, this is evidence of accelerated nuclear decay, and therefore the young Earth. The thing is, though, that the model didn't actually predict any new data, it just fit the old data, which is all well and good, but subsequent testing by Gary H. Lochelt to see if their model can predict in more detail things like surface concentration of helium, which by the rate model should be abundant, has failed to support the young Earth creationist model. Instead, the testing resulted in concentrations more similar to his two-state model, in which helium exists in both loosely bound and tightly bound states, such that heating experiments will mostly release loosely bound helium at a relatively rapid rate, but that tightly bound helium is lost at a much lower rate. But when the crystal is ground up for mass spectrometry, there is no way to tell the difference between the kinds of helium. The test he did for surface region helium is based on this idea. If all the helium has the same rate of diffusion out of the crystal, then there should be no relative abundance or depletion at different parts of the zircon. However, if he is correct, then the areas of the zircon near the surface should be relatively depleted compared to areas in the inner parts of the zircon. He found results that matched his prediction. So in addition to accelerated nuclear decay being physically impossible, the experiments purported to show that it must have happened anyway don't really indicate that.
To use an analogy, if you jack up your car while it's still warm, the engine is warm, and you want to drain the oil, you pull the drain plug and let it drain into the pan. At first, that hot oil flows out practically like water, and you drain 6 quarts. Most of it drains in less than a minute. Then it starts dripping, and then it starts dripping real slow.
Unless this analogy is just about the rate of diffusion going up as heat goes up, which is true, I'm not sure what he's getting at. And if that is all this is, it hardly needed an analogy, but whatever. Of course, the fact is that the variability of the rate of diffusion of helium from zircon as a function of temperature does not make the concentration of helium in zircons more or less useless as a dating mechanism, because unlike spontaneous decay, it can be dramatically influenced by things like the thermal history of the zircon crystal. Once again, creationists love to use things with a variable rate as if they didn't, and things with a fixed rate as if they were variable. Creationism really is an inversion of science right to the core of being conclusion first, evidence second, if at all. It's like they took science, multiplied it by -1, and then just tried to pretend they hadn't.
If somebody comes around the corner and says, "Hey, Tom, what are you doing there?" "Oh, I'm changing my oil." I said, "How much oil you got in that bucket?" "Nah, about 6 quarts. "Wow, it's dripping so slow. It must have taken you days to accumulate that much oil." I said, "Well, no, you made an assumption. You assumed it always was at this slow rate. In fact, it was very fast at the beginning, and most of that got there in less than a minute, not days."
Well, it's worse than I thought. The oil was an analogy for the nuclides that decayed to make the helium, it seems, not the helium itself. The big difference, of course, being that the viscosity of oil is in fact hugely affected by temperature, whereas spontaneous nuclear decay is not until the thermal energy exceeds the binding energy of the nuclei, which doesn't happen until like quintillions Kelvin, a temperature not reachable on Earth, and one so hot that we're approaching the level where the Earth would just have long ago exploded, leaving Noah in a bit of a predicament, since wooden boats might work for a flood, but they tend not to work when the Death Star shows up to blow your whole planet up, which is the kind of heat that would be needed to even potentially cause heat to change decay rates. And it wouldn't change them by accelerating the rates anyway. It would just single-handedly destroy the nuclei, basically causing them to fission into a bunch of dissociated protons and neutrons. But even then, this is all speculative, because we can't actually do physics at these kinds of energy levels. There just is no mechanism to make spontaneous nuclear decay speed up, but keep the same decay chains. No one has proposed such a mechanism, not even the rate team who concluded that they needed exotic physics, which is just code for them not having a way within understood physics for their ideas to even be possible. Never mind plausible or probable.
So if you have a lot of oil, it does not equate to a long time if it got there fast. Same with the radioisotopes. If you have a lot of daughter product, but it got there by fast decay, it does not equate to millions of years, even though it is in the rocks.
Sure, and once someone finds a mechanism for speeding up nuclear decay, overcomes the problem that we actually have not enough helium for accelerated decay, not too much, and then figures out where all the heat would go, since even if heat isn't the cause of the accelerated decay, the decay itself would, by the rate team's own admission, release enough heat to vaporize the crust of the Earth several times over, then we can talk. So far we're at step -1. Step 0 would be acknowledgement that these are real problems that need to be worked on. We're still getting creationists to that point, although to their credit, at least some of them have figured this out and are at step 0. Step 1 is formulating some hypothesis that is testable that could solve any of these problems. Step 2 would be actually testing it. And let's remember that when you're trying to overturn the universal scientific consensus, the onus is on you as the rebel. So this is not something real scientists need to do. This is something that charlatans need to do to convince the scientific community that they are not, in fact, charlatans.
Now, in this radioisotope in the Age of the Earth project, they documented that uranium-238 When it decays, it goes through various decay products.
Well, they may have documented that, but they certainly weren't the first ones to do that. The decay chain of all isotopes of uranium is well known and has been for many decades.
Until it ends in the stable daughter product of lead-206. 8 times during the decay chain, it throws out alpha particles. Now, an alpha particle is chemically identical to the nucleus of a helium-4 gas atom.
It's not just chemically identical, it's identical in every way, because it is a helium-4 nucleus.
In other words, it has 2 protons and 2 neutrons.
That's true.
When it's thrown out, it picks up donor electrons from the environment and becomes full-blown helium-4 gas. So the upshot is you can't have this type of alpha radioisotope decay taking place without, as of necessity by chemical law, producing a large byproduct of helium gas.
Yes, but this is undisputed. So what's the real argument here?
The problem is that the gas leaks out of rocks. At the atomic level, rocks aren't all that solid. They're full of all kinds of cracks and fissures. And helium has only got 2 protons. It's the second smallest element to hydrogen, which only has 1 proton. So it's incredibly small. It's a light gas, so it likes to work its way up through the rocks to the surface of the Earth, into the atmosphere, and ultimately does escape into outer space.
In fact, right now, humans are using helium at a rate that will probably deplete the Earth's reserves in not that long. Like, we could be facing helium price surges in decades. And yeah, part of the problem is that helium likes to escape into space because it's so light that it can easily get enough kinetic energy to reach Earth's escape velocity.
So if this was being produced by slow radioactive decay, you would also have this commensurate amount of helium gas produced as well. And what they found was, if we have instruments now apparently accurate enough to count the number of lead-206 atoms, you multiply that times 8, that tells you exactly how many helium gas atoms were produced, so we can keep track of them. How fast have they been leaking? How far have they gotten? And what they have found is truly amazing, that this will leak through the rock matrix at the atomic level. It can't be held down. Helium is a noble gas, which means it's kind of like Teflon. It doesn't want to chemically bond or stick to anything, so it just goes right through these rocks, doesn't get bonded with anything. Leaks out of the zircon crystals, which are the primary crystals that hold the uranium and thorium atoms that decay and give off the helium. And it's leaking at such a rate that at the surface of the rocks is leaking out of the Earth's surface at an average rate of about 13 million helium atoms per square inch per second.
I mean, so far he's not really wrong. It's just this isn't going to help him, because the assumption he's making, but not really stating, is that all helium will escape at about the same rate because all helium has about the same opportunity to escape with the zircon. This is clearly not true. Think of the zircon like a mesh sieve, and the helium like flour. The mesh is fine, but not so fine that the individual grains of flour can't escape, and so you use it to get fine powdery flour with no lumps into whatever you're cooking. You can calculate a fairly reliable age of flour escape through the sieve with a given intensity of shaking of the sieve. But let's say that behind your back I have come and put superglue in some parts of the mesh, which has now cured, forming parts of the mesh that allow no or far fewer bits of flour through. You can still get a decent estimate for how much flour should escape per unit time with consistent shaking of the sieve. But when you're done getting the flour out by just shaking the sieve, you'll find that in areas with the superglue that is now cured, some extra flour will be left behind. And so while you might normally expect to find no flour after sifting flour until it stops coming out, now you actually find a measurable remaining amount you were not expecting. That's basically what is happening with the helium. Some of the helium has easier access to escape, some of it is more effectively trapped and has fewer large enough gaps to escape through, which means that you will tend to find more helium than a naive calculation with a diffusion rate would tend to predict.
Of course, if it's been leaking at that relatively fast rate, then there shouldn't be a lot of helium byproduct left over in the vicinity, but there is. We find it still trapped in the original zircon crystals, and that simply should not be the case.
It should be given a more sophisticated model, which has in fact been supported against the naive model Humphreys went with in his experiment. The ball is in the creationist court. Let's see if they serve.
What's shown here on the left is that the uranium decay clock they claim was so slow that to produce those amount of lead-206 atoms at the bottom there took about 1.5 billion years.
Pretty normal for a zircon to be that old.
But it's joined like a Siamese twin to this helium clock that also tells us something about what went on there. And what it tells us is that it must have been much faster because
the correct thing to do when you have seemingly contradictory data, and one set comes from something that is known to be basically unable to vary, and the other is from something that is known to be able to vary wildly, what you should do is assume that the invariant process varied and that the variable process did not. That makes lots of sense.
the helium, if it was being slowly produced over hundreds of millions of years until you get to 1.5 billion years, it would have plenty of time to leak out of the zircon crystal, out of the rock matrix of the crust of the Earth, into the atmosphere, even into space. There should be hardly any radiogenic helium in the crust of the Earth if it had that much time to leak at the rate at which it leaks.
Yeah, if all the helium had the same rate of leakage, but we have good reason to say it did not. Now, I won't say that we know it won't, because frankly, not many people care. Humphreys is a nobody screaming into the void with a few other nobodies, who is making no advancements in science, is largely not even trying to get his work peer-reviewed, and who is pushing for a view of science that, if accepted, would effectively end the scientific enterprise as a whole, and all in favor of ideas that were already shown to be false centuries ago. So, as a result, as far as I can tell, only the aforementioned Gary H. Lochelt is even bothering to respond to this, although unsurprisingly, when he attempted to publish this in a creationist so-called journal, they dicked around for a year requesting infinite revisions. Because let's remember, you can't publish in creationist publications if you don't toe the line, even if the line is easily demonstrably wrong. But this does not mean that I don't have a good reason to think that anyone, Humphreys included, has a robust and well-supported model of helium diffusions from zircon. But I will say that Lochelt's hypothesis at least has going for it that it is so far a better match for the data, and doesn't involve physically impossible things like accelerated nuclear decay.
And so we would find that it should have leaked out. There should be very little there. Yet when we look at these clocks, we find an amazing thing.
To be a clock, it must have an invariant rate. Helium diffusion does not. It's not a clock.
The amount of helium still trapped in the zircon crystal is still at the majority level.
I'm assuming what he means by that is that the level of helium is above half of what we would expect given the evident amount of decay that would produce alpha particles.
Less than half of it has leaked out.
Yep, but that's not usually expressed by majority level. It's stuff like this that clues you in that Kindell doesn't really do much actual reading of scientific literature. Not even at a lay level, never mind technical papers.
At the rate that it is leaking, it appears to have only been leaking for about 6,000 years, plus or minus 2,000 years.
So, I haven't really wanted to say it, because for some reason I'm trying to be cordial and polite right now. But, that correspondence was almost certainly p-hacked. In other words, the rate team knew they needed 6,000 years, they had data, and they just came up with a model that both fit the existing data and provided a date of about 6,000 years ago for how long the helium has been escaping. The fact that it did not successfully predict new data is itself a confirmation of this. Now, I can't say for certain it was p-hacked, as I wasn't there when they were deriving their model from their data and conclusion. But let's just say that the coincidences are pretty suspicious, and I don't think they're coincidences at all. But hey, that's just my opinion.
So, if even 15,000 years had passed, it should have all leaked completely out of the original host zircon crystals. But it hasn't even done that. The majority is still there.
Shame about those experimental results, though.
That means that radioisotope decay must have produced this byproduct so rapidly and so recently, it hasn't had time to leak out of the original crystals yet, even though it's leaking at a relatively rapid rate.
Okay, he's now just repeating himself. I'm not going to subject you to that.
The evolutionists say, yeah, but rapid radioactive isotope decay would produce too much heat.
So let me be clear.
It was also the rate team who said that, and who said that they did not have a solution to the problem.
And that would be a big problem, and we have no model that can, explain rapid radioisotope decay.
Yep, whereas there is a model that can explain helium retention in zircons.
Well, with the standard model of the atom, we don't that well, but there is another competing model for the structure of the atom.
Ooh, I didn't know the creationists had their own atomic model. This will be very interesting, especially since the model scientists use is quite robust and based on well-established physics.
It's known as the Lucas-Bergman model.
Based on what I can find, this model treats electrons as rings rather than as point-like. I don't see how that could possibly be the key to accelerating nuclear decay. since spontaneous nuclear decay is governed by the nuclear forces, not the electromagnetic force that keeps electrons doing their thing in the context of atoms. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong model, though.
Yeah, it's a relatively recent model. It was developed, I believe, in the 1980s. But nobody's actually disproved that model. It's just the standard model has gotten entrenched in the scientific mind.
Yeah, on looking more into this, it seems to be both a model that is not parsimonious and that will not help Kendall in the least. I would love to know what about treating charged particles as rings would mean that spontaneous nuclear decay can just decide to speed up one day. If anyone has any ideas, please let me know in the comments. But also, we have done a lot of particle accelerator experiments, and they have all been consistent with point-like fundamental particles. So there's also experimental evidence that the Lucas-Bergman model is just wrong.
It's been around nearly 100 years. It works well enough that, if it works, don't bother with it.
When he says it works well enough, what he means is that it is the basis for electronics, chemistry, nuclear physics, computing, nuclear power generation, radiomedicine, etc. It works well enough that we base a huge swath of important technology on that model, and the technology works reliably and in ways that would be incredible just a few generations of humans ago. This is like saying, well, Einstein works well enough, all while we use his theories to get GPS going, to predict orbits, and to fly through space. It's hard to imagine how it could work any better.
But the proponents of the Lucas-Bergman model say that their model is superior.
Well, yeah, otherwise they probably wouldn't be proponents of it. But also, after doing some searching, I can't find anyone who fits that description besides Lucas himself. So it seems like those proponents aren't exactly a big population. Not that it's a popularity contest, but the fact that they've made no progress in shifting the scientific consensus in like 40 years means that the field just isn't impressed.
That it can explain things the standard model can't. It makes predictions that the standard model doesn't make, which hold out to be true.
Such as? Oh wait, this is Thomas Kendall, the man who's deathly allergic to giving examples of his wild and preposterous claims.
But perhaps most significantly of all, it not only allows for but predicts rapid initial radioisotope decay and then slow decay thereafter.
It actually doesn't. It just predicts, according to Lucas at least, in a Microsoft Word document that he self-published, that it can account for the time dilation effects of relativity without needing relativity to be real. So in fact, this model is not just an attempt at a new model of particle physics, but also an attempted refutation of special relativity, which is a damn tall order, absurd on its face, and still doesn't help young earthers. I must say, it's not often that in defense of absurdity, a pseudoscience peddler will appeal to an even more absurd pseudoscience that wouldn't even help him if it were real. Also interestingly, Lucas thinks that the model has solved the so-called problem that electrons do not shed radiation as they orbit. Of course, orbitals aren't orbits, and the electron doesn't actually circle the nucleus, so this is a fake problem that is being solved.
And it predicts that it can happen without having excessive heat.
No, the heat is unavoidable. Decay literally is the emission of particles. Those particles cannot be emitted without carrying energy with them. That energy will start out as kinetic, but through interactions with other particles, it will end up as thermal energy. There simply is no model that can overcome this. This is basic conservation of energy stuff here. We're talking about the first law of thermodynamics. If the Lucas-Bergman model actually did predict that the first law of thermodynamics was just silly nonsense, that on its own would be good reason to reject it, since the laws of thermodynamics are some of the most well-attested laws in all of physics. Now, as near as I can tell, it does no such thing, so that's good for the Lucas-Bergman model. But it also means that there's no help for Kendall. Also, I would note that if he thinks that this is so promising, rather than telling the internet about it, Kendall should approach the RATE team and show them what little on this model exists, and I mean little. I've been looking around and have found little more than a Word document that describes the model in any detail. This idea is obscure far beyond the normal obscurity that I deal with when it comes to young Earth creationism. Also, I suspect that Lucas would not agree with Kendall about most of this, but I can't say for sure, really.
Which is something that we also have evidence for in the rocks. We have radio halos produced by alpha radiation that produces damage in the rocks. And when you cut a cross-section to it, it looks like concentric circles of damage. But we have all these radioisotope halos indicating a lot of decay produced, but it didn't produce enough heat to melt the rocks.
Yes, which is evidence that there never was accelerated decay. The heat is required by the first law of thermodynamics, so if accelerated decay happened, there was heat. There is no other option. If we see no evidence of heat, then there was no accelerated decay. Full stop.
Because if the rocks melted, it would erase the evidence of the radioisotope rings, the radio halos.
Well, it doesn't have to fully melt, it just has to metamorphose a bit. The temperature at which things like these halos, as well as fission tracks, would be erased is called the annealing temperature. Basically, it's the temperature at which the crystal structure of the rock can kind of reset and erase these disruptions to it. If a rock still has such marks, it means that it has never reached the annealing temperature since these things were formed, giving us a vague idea of the rock's thermal history. And the fact that many rocks have extensive such signs of decay means that the rocks were never hot enough to account for that much decay in the span of just over a year. Because again, you can't get decay without heat. That's a violation of the first law of thermodynamics. That kinetic energy would have to simply be deleted from the universe for this to work. That's not how it works. Energy is conserved. If you start with potential energy in the nucleus, that is being carried away as kinetic energy by the radiation, and the only place for that energy to go is to turn into thermal energy in the rock system as a whole. Pretending that electrons are rings isn't going to change that.
So we have evidence of rapid decay.
No, we don't.
We have evidence that radioisotope decay can take place without melting the rocks, without producing excessive heat.
Well, yes, but that requires it to take place over hundreds of millions to billions of years.
And we have at least a theoretical model of the atom that would both explain and predict that.
No, we don't. Not even near, as I can tell, according to the guys who created the model. And the proponents of this model don't even understand the model they think they're trying to replace.
So I think we need to do further research on this, but we do at least have the smoking gun.
I would love to see creationists doing research on donut electrons. Also, I would love an explanation as to how ring-shaped quarks somehow mean that the strong and weak forces don't act the way that we know they do from experiment. That would be needed for accelerated nuclear decay. It's fun that Kindell didn't even attempt an explanation of that.
That the physical presence of the byproduct helium-4 gas is a major headache to them. They cannot explain how in the world it could still be there in the original zircon crystals.
Actually, they can, fairly easily, and with better predictions than the models Humphreys tried to use. It's just that it doesn't come up much, because only creationists are stupid enough to think that they can break all of nuclear physics and thermodynamics by scratching their heads and saying, "Oi, that's a lot of helium, isn't it?"
So we not only have this evidence, but the fact that they can't correctly identify young rocks in the blind test. They always take them to be old.
Actually, no. It's the creationists who typically can't get their correct ages, and primarily because they are either amazingly bad at their jobs or are just frauds. I'll let the audience decide which one is more likely. Like when Steve Austin got all results from Mount St. Helens that were effectively the same age as zero, but had reported values of about 200,000 years, he took it as a refutation of radiometric dating, either not realizing that if you use a technique that is known to not work for what you want to do with it, and then it doesn't work, that you haven't overturned the technique, or just being a fraud. And then the one date that he did get back that wasn't just equivalent to zero, he had very obvious xenocrysts in his sample that would give him an erroneously old date, and his response was just, nuh-uh. It's not scientists who have trouble dating, it's creationists who seem to be the incels here.
And most of all, we have the evidence of the soft tissue, intact cell structure, and largely intact proteins, which simply could not have survived the ravages of thermodynamic decay and of ground radiation bombardment for anything more than a few 100,000 years.
No, we don't. They're not intact, and what we do have, indeed, could survive about forever.
This is sufficient evidence to completely destroy the evolutionary interpretation of the fossil record and the alleged geological column. It simply cannot be true. Something that outstandingly agrees with all this evidence.
Yes, in make-believe world, the evidence points towards a flood, because make-believe is what the flood is. Here in real life, though, sorry, there is no evidence for a global flood, and both literal and figurative mountains of evidence against it. And pretending that maybe electrons are shaped like a ring does not solve that problem.
It's a literal biblical global flood no more than about 5,000 years ago. That would explain why these fossils still have helium in them, because it hasn't been that long ago, or excuse me, not helium, but carbon-14, and would explain why the soft tissue, cell structure, and proteins are still largely intact. Again, there simply has not been enough time for them to have been degraded.
You serious?
And that's it. After this, he just tries to sell his DVD. I don't care about that. If you care about that, his DVDs are thousands, not billions, challenging an icon of evolution, questioning the age of the Earth, and The Case for Creation, Scientific Evidence for a Young Age of the Earth. Fun that he just stole the title of The Case for Creation from Lee Strobel's much more popular work, The Case for a Creator. But who cares? Probably not even Strobel. Well, I cannot say that I had denying the first law of thermodynamics or donut-shaped electrons on my bingo card. It was interesting to get some novel arguments at least, but that being said, virtually everything Kindell said was demonstrably wrong, and the rest was not helpful to his case. So, yet another pathetic showing from creationists. It's almost like all the evidence is against them. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Ben Tovind, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Eleron Teller, Phil Rivara, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, Wallace, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, and Tapioca Weasel. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.